Is March, as we're recording, May 26th, 9 a.m. We are looking for a roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Bogue.
Here.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Here.
Commissioner Hackett.
Here.
Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Nanjapa. Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 6 out of 7 commissioners present.
Excellent, and that is a quorum, and Commissioner Nanjapa is out, but will likely join us a little bit later this morning. Forward to that. With that, we have a full house today. We have presentations from staff on financial assurances, presentations from industry on financial assurances. We've got a variance. We've got approximately 18 members of the public that will be commenting. A public comment will start approximately 11:45, and then we have a consent agenda. So with that, I would look to Director Murphy for a brief report, followed by a staff presentation on financial assurances.
Thanks, Chair. I have a pretty brief report, and if you're okay with it, I'll just kind of roll from that into the presentation itself, because the presentation is pretty informal, which is me providing an update. There's no fancy PowerPoint today, and we don't get the benefit of Joel talking to us, which is always a sad day for me. So on the rulemaking side, in terms of implementation, we're continuing to have monthly meetings around what implementation looks like. We're getting good feedback on the rules now that they've been in place for about, a little over 4 months. We are also working on the financial assurance rulemaking, which is the subject of today's later presentation. I would flag that I think staff is, working through some draft rules. I would anticipate noticing those on or before June 15th. And the other big picture piece on the mission change rulemaking is, Chair, I think the suggestion to have staff talk about what internal processes may have changed makes a lot of sense, because I think that maybe staff right now looks a little bit like a duck swimming on water who's paddling like crazy underneath, right? I see the day-to-day changes in how we're doing business, how we're thinking about things, how we're approaching issues, and what we're trying to accomplish in implementing these rules. But it was made very clear to me that the rest of the world doesn't get to see that. And so managers are looking forward to talking about what those changes can look like to help people see a little bit into what our day-to-day work is. In line with that, increasing our transparency and accessibility has continued to be a priority for this organization, albeit we haven't quite moved as fast as some would hope, or as smoothly as some would hope. In that vein, we would like to make some updates to the website to kind of reduce the number of clicks through to particular types of information. We're working through those with somebody who can update the website. And we're really focusing on the hearings pages and the Senate Bill 19-181 pages. Once we get those changes finalized and built out, we will spend some time walking the commissioners in real time through those changes during a public meeting, so that we can help explain what it is that we're doing. And we're also thinking about trying to put either a short video or a PowerPoint on the website to help folks navigate. I'm a little bit of an old dog, so I know how to get to things even if we make them more efficient. So I hope that this gives us all a better opportunity to understand where information is housed and how to get there, and to some degree what it means. I don't really have any other really substantive updates. If commissioners have questions about that or about any operational type stuff, I'm happy to take them. And if there are none, I'll just kind of roll straight into updating folks about financial assurance.
That sounds good, Director Murphy. So do you anticipate then that we would be receiving updates from your manager staff relative to kind of like what's happening on the ground here within the next month or so? Or
I think we can do that. I want to make sure we get the right information across, and hopefully I can work with you to help identify the right date and time and kind of amount of time to dedicate to that in terms of hearing presentation time. But I think in the next few weeks, certainly by the end of June.
And again, for those that are listening in, what we're talking about here is getting an update from commission staff relevant to things that are happening on the ground with regard to the new rules that may establish sort of the more protective flavor of the work that we're doing that you wouldn't otherwise necessarily see by just a random visit to our website. So looking to try to get some information out to the public and to our stakeholders and to industry relevant to the good work that's happening on the ground, because I know there's a lot going on there, and I'm really appreciative of the great leadership there, Director Murphy, and the leadership from your management team in that front. I know there's a lot going on. So we'll look forward to that presentation once your staff is ready for it. And with that, I think you can seamlessly roll into financial assurances update, and then we'll roll into the industry update as well.
Great, thank you. And I would flag that I have a fairly brief update. I think there were 3 outstanding questions that staff wanted to commit to following up on. One is a review of the 5 additional studies that are looking at emissions from plugged or idle wells. I'm going to use idle wells for this conversation just because I think it better describes the category of wells we're talking about, and inactive for our rules has such a specific meaning. We completed the review of those 5 studies. We have updated the literature review document that we prepared a few weeks ago. That updated document will be available on our website, and it will be flagged that it's been updated for folks who want to read in detail what our analysis was. I think at a high level, what I would summarize is that we're grateful to have these 5 additional studies, and fundamentally they don't change the summary or takeaway that Joel presented, or AAG Minor presented a couple weeks ago, which is that idle and plugged wells are not significant relative to other sources of emissions, and that plugged wells in particular have negligible or near zero emissions. So again, it's good to continue to see and review and understand the data that's out there, as it helps shape what policy decisions we as a commission want to make. And I think that on balance, that's really good news for the environment. So that's a quick update there. Again, we will get the study document or study literature review document updated, the updated version of it available on the website later today. And I'm sure somebody will chat me in the middle of this meeting to say, hey, it's live. And when that happens, I'll let everybody know. The second question that was posed by commissioners that I needed to follow up on, we're connecting with Alaska, Wyoming, and North Dakota about their experience with changing financial assurance rules. I was able to talk to leadership at each of those states over the last couple of weeks and had really good and insightful conversations, and that certainly have helped me shape what I'm thinking and things that we should be considering. The specific question was really geared towards whether there was an uptick in bankruptcies as a result of financial assurance changes in those states, and the broadest answer is no, there wasn't. There were a couple of bankruptcies that did occur, but whether it was a result of financial assurance or the kind of the operator's existing financial state would certainly be an open question. So the big picture answer to the question of whether the changes to Alaska, Wyoming, and North Dakota's financial assurance rules created a cascade of bankruptcies is no. The third question that staff committed to following up on it was about Texas, the state of Texas inactive well requirements, and I have a more detailed summary with citations if folks want to see it. The big picture takeaway that I read that would be relevant is that Texas's definition of inactive is pretty akin to ours, no production over the course of a year, our current definition, and that plugging is required unless an operator, plugging is required if a well is inactive for more than 1 year, unless the operator obtains permission from the Texas Railroad Commission to either to extend the deadline, to extend that deadline. And the operator needs to demonstrate a good faith claim to a continuing right to operate the well. And the well and its associated facilities need to be in compliance with commission rules for that extension. If you want detailed citations or a bigger dig into that, I'm happy to provide it, but I wanted to give really that high level overview of things to be thinking about. And I think that's really the fundamental piece that we all need to be considering over the next couple of months, is what are the big picture components and how do we build those components together into a successful financial assurance regime for the state of Colorado. So with that, Chair and Commissioners, I'd be happy to take questions, happy to talk more about this, and I guess fair warning that was an incredibly brief update on 3 or 4 different topics for me. So
Do we have questions from commissioners? Commissioner Messmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Director Murphy. I would be interested in the more detailed analysis documents. So, because I'm a geek and I like to read that stuff, but so I don't know how to get those from you, but I'd love to see them.
yep.
Might as well make that available to all of us. Looking at heads nodding up and down. So thank you, Director Murphy. Other questions for the director? Okay, seeing none, we will now roll into the industry presentation on financial assurance. And we've got a whole heck of a lot of people signed up for this effort. So Ms. Larson, I'll let you do the honor of getting these 8 or 9 people into the meeting, and we will determine whom it is that is going to lead off.
Super, we'll start getting them in.
To the 80 participants that are with us, just bear with. We've got about 9 or 10 people that we need to bring to the participant stage, and we are in the process of doing that. So we'll get started here in another few minutes.
Mr. Chair, we'll begin with the Small Operator Society, and then when their presentation is completed, we can then move on to the other panelists.
Okay, sounds good. It looks like Mr. Bradley has shared his screen. Mr. Bradley, I think you have the floor.
Sure. Oh, I got it unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Mr. Bradley.
And I should have Trisha around also to help answer questions at the end.
Yes, I saw Ms. Fanning as well as part of the panelists, so I believe you're both ready to go.
Awesome. And I got my screen shared. You can see my little title page here.
Straight talk, Mr. Bradley.
Straight talk. That's right. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to address you all today. This engagement we've had so far on financial assurance has been extensive, and it's an important topic. So we really appreciate everybody taking it so seriously. I think you know who I am at this point. We're Small Operator Society. If you want to see a list of our members, you can go to our website here, smalloperatorsociety.org. But we're, a group of like 60 some Colorado operators. And today I want to focus on stripper wells. So I've only got like 8 slides. We'll kind of breeze through them and give plenty of time for back and forth as you guys wish. But we're going to sort of do an overview of stripper operators, stripper wells. We're going to sort of talk about NOAVs, look a little closer at the orphan well program, talk about P&A costs, and sort of the current financial assurance proposals that Small Operator Society has on the table. So let's just jump into it. So what is a stripper operator? In my mind, a stripper operator is an operator who has a portfolio where their average well makes less than 15 BOE a day. So you take an operator's total production and divide it by their total well count. And if that average is less than 15 BOE a day, that's what I consider to be a stripper operator. And if you look at all operators in Colorado, about 9 out of 10 operators fall into this category. Okay, it's not a small group. Stripper operators did not create orphan wells in 2020. Okay, so it's important to keep in mind that the bankruptcy and orphan well portfolio additions we sort of talk about and hear about from 2020 was PetroShare, and their average well made 27 BOE a day. Stripper operators are critical to the well-being of rural citizens. And I know we're not supposed to talk about money anymore since 181, but the reality is that stripper operators pay a lot in ad valorem taxes, which is county and local taxes. And this year, stripper operators will pay over $100 million in local taxes, which are used directly for the well-being of citizens to fund hospitals and critical services and things like that. So it's important to sort of keep that in mind as we go through the broader discussion. Stripper operators are typically small operators, and they are more financially efficient than larger operators for some obvious reasons, right? There's not the big corporate overhead of multiple layers of management and reporting costs due to being public. Stripper operators are typically producers and are not focused on drilling new wells, and so their number one focus is producing the wells they have, and this sort of allows them time and creativity to get more production out of the wellbore. And we'll talk more about that when we sort of touch on stripper wells. And the last thing that's important to keep in mind is that stripper operators are not a unique compliance risk. And I do have another slide where we'll talk specifically on NOAVs. But if you go out and pull all the NOAVs in the last 3 years, so May 1st of 17 through May 1st of 2021. And it's important to remember that NOAV stands for Notice of Alleged Violation. But if you pull them all, 50% of all those NOAVs were from only 23 operators, okay? So saying it differently, only 10% of statewide operators accounted for 50% of all NOAVs over the last 3 years. And if you look closer at that group of 23 operators, there's roughly an even split between operators that are stripper operators and operators that are non-stripper operators. And there's also kind of a roughly even split between large companies and small companies. And this is all built off public data. And so, if you wanted to go verify this or talk more about it, we can talk offline and I can sort of show you the valuations. So now let's just sort of do a quick overview on stripper wells, okay? Because a well is a stripper well does not automatically mean it's at the end of life. And so what I have here is a plot of a stripper well in Colorado. This is out in Washington County. And this plot is oil rate on the y-axis in barrels per day, and 10 barrels per day is right down the middle. And then time, these are years, on the x-axis. And so you can see this well turned on in the 80s at just over 15 barrels a day and produced for almost 2 decades under what we would consider to be primary recovery, right? Which is sort of natural depletion of the reservoir. And if we need to talk more about what is primary recovery and what is secondary recovery and what is tertiary recovery, we can do that. But the point is that for about 2 decades, this well produced under primary recovery, and you can see it sort of starts out flat and then declines. And then for the subsequent 2 decades or 3 decades, it goes on secondary recovery, and you can see rates actually increasing over time. So the point is that the economic life of stripper wells are extended by recompletes and secondary recovery, or even tertiary recovery. And this well, this is a conventional oil well, it's over 40 years old. And this well has another 40 years of life in it. It just does. And there's many conventional gas and oil wells, and even some unconventionals like coal bed methane wells in Colorado that are similar to this. So the point of this slide is that we can't assume that just because it's a stripper well, it's at the end of life. So now let's talk a little more on NOAVs. And like I said, I went out to the COGCC database and pulled all the NOAVs in the last 3 years. There's about 1,000 of them, okay? And then I started digging in and subtotaling and classifying these NOAVs. And it's you get some really interesting things out of the data, okay? Only 1 in 7 of these NOAVs are environmental violations. So the remaining, 86% of these NOAVs are record keeping and reporting violations. That's just sort of an interesting data point. Like we talked about, half of these NOAVs are from only 23 operators, right? And so 10% of operators account for half of these. And there's really no uniqueness to this group of 23 operators. Some of them are stripper operators, some of them are non-stripper operators, some of them are large, some of them are small. And the rest, the other 50% of these NOAVs are spread across about 154 operators. So what's the point of me telling you all this? Is that it's important to keep in mind that the bad apple operators, so to speak, are a minority, a small minority of operators, and they're not unique to being a stripper operator or being a small company. So this slide is kind of interesting, and I just wanted to put this out there because I sort of dug into the orphan well program that's listed. It's linked on the COGCC website. If you go to the homepage, there's a quick link to the orphan well program, and it pulls up this Google page. And it has a project list with status and spend. And on the website, it's not really subtotaled and averaged, but you can pull this table down. And it's pretty interesting if you dig in to what's in this table. It has, project name and, where the wells came from and what bonds came with it and how much money's been spent and what the status of the project is. And then counts, well counts and site counts. And it's pretty interesting if you start subtotaling this and look at the wells that are just listed as completed, right? Which I assume means they've been plugged, abandoned, remediated, and reclaimed. The average cost of these 225 wells was only like $5,300. That surprised me, okay? And then if you look at the in progress projects, the average cost to date is about $27,000. And it's interesting to sort of look at this data and go, okay, if we look back at the dollars that have actually been spent, there's a pretty big disconnect between the historical actuals and what I'm hearing people talk about as far as like an $80,000 plus per well liability. Okay, so it's just important to keep this data in mind. Now, is it possible that costs are increasing? Yes, costs are absolutely increasing, but it's a big jump to get from 5,000 or 25,000 all the way up to 80,000. So this slide, you cannot go out and pull public data on and verify. This is, we've shown this map a couple times. So what Small Operator Society did is we went out and polled members and said, what is it costing you on a dollar per well basis to plug and remediate wells today? Okay. And obviously there's some factors that dominate these plugging and reclamation and remediation costs. Topography, location, and environment is a huge one, right? What sort of weather do you have to work with? How far do you have to haul soil, if you have to haul soil out or in? How deep are the wells? Is it a multi-well battery or a single well battery? The current remediation and reclamation regulations, and just overall company procedures. All these things are sort of major factors that can dominate your plugging and reclamation costs. So we asked everybody to boil it down to where they operate and what their single well P&A reclamation and remediation costs are. And these are the results. And the point of this slide is to show that this is a complex issue, right? It's hard to come up with one number that is a catch-all for the state, because out east, where the weather and topography is very friendly, the wells are shallow, plugging and remediating and reclaiming is very inexpensive. But when you get into, the rural areas along the Front Range or the Western Slope where you're in tough topography, it can get expensive quick. So it's just important to keep this sort of variability across the state in mind. So you have heard me talk about a lot. We've had individual meetings about the Small Operator Society financial assurance proposal. And the first one is the one we've talked about, which is to sort of mimic the Lust Trust program from the Oil and Public Safety Division in Colorado. This is associated with the gas station industry, and some pros and cons of that, right? We're not reinventing the wheel. It's proven by another industry to achieve several key goals that I have, right? Which is it's equitable to large and small companies. It addresses orphan assets. It encourages owners of assets to remediate them and reclaim them, and it encourages redevelopment, right? Because a developer who wants to build an apartment building on a site where there is an old gas station can take advantage of this program. Some cons of this is implementing and administrating it, right? It is, I don't know if I'd call it a complex program, but it's not a simple program. And another con of this is to apply it to upstream. It may require legislation. And so we were asked to go back and see if we could sharpen our pencils and come up with another proposal. And so today we have I guess what I would consider to be a simpler pay-as-you-go financial assurance proposal, which is all operators save, right? And the details around save in quotes need to be discussed. But essentially, 0.5% or 0.5% of annual gross revenue per well gets put into a financial assurance fund. Every well, every operator across the state. This would raise about the same amount of money annually as our previous proposal. It's about $60 million per year. When you look at statewide production and you assume a reasonable oil price of like $50 per barrel and a gas price of $2 per MCF. And so that achieves kind of every operator has a financial assurance account that's tied to wells, that's building money over time. But we also wanted to be able to address orphan wells with this program, right? And so we said, okay, let's also give the COGCC the capability where if they had a portfolio of orphan wells to address, they could essentially pull funds from this large bond or large financial assurance account to address orphan wells. And so kind of the pros of this type approach is that it's much simpler and easier to implement, and it can address orphan wells. I mean, I'm not sure why we couldn't just, add 0.5% to the mill levy and make sure that it's designated as financial assurance. But some of the cons of this program is it doesn't really encourage operators to P&A, right? And it doesn't really encourage redevelopment, because unlike the Lush Trust program, operators can't go in and utilize these funds, or developers who want to move in and redevelop a property can't go in and operate and access these funds. So the last thing I want to talk about, and then we'll just sort of open it up for questions and discussion if you wish, is what I call the bonding bear traps, okay? So false assumptions, right? And let's just run through some of these. I hear these a lot, right? Large operators are more financially stable than small operators, okay? Well, there's several large Colorado operators who filed for bankruptcy in 2020. So this is a false assumption. Here's another one that I like. Large operators have other assets to go after in the case of an orphan well problem. Well, there's an operator in California who spun off its California assets into another company to isolate the rest of the company's portfolio. And I was hanging out with some of the Nebraska oil and gas commissioners and commission staff, and they told me an operator in Oklahoma moved into Nebraska, drilled some horizontal wells to test a play. It didn't work out. And it's looking like they're going to spin those wells off into another company and give them to Nebraska as orphan wells. Okay. So this is a false assumption. I like this one. We touched on this one. Large operators are more compliant than small operators. Well, if you actually pull and look at the NOAV data, it shows that the bad apple operators they're not unique to size. That ties into this next one. This one's my favorite. Stripper wells are bad for the environment. Stripper wells are bad. No, okay. Bad operators are bad for the environment. It's the old, it's the archer, not the arrow. And then, here's the last one. Colorado has an orphan well problem. Well, I don't think so. I mean, 2020 was very, very hard on the oil and gas industry, right? Prices went negative. That's never happened before. And if I sort of sit down and look at what occurred with PetroShare, I think it turned out pretty good. Other operators stepped up and took a bunch of those assets, and the state was left with a full PetroShare bond to address the rest. So that's my update for today. We did submit a written response to the questions that you commissioners asked a few weeks ago, but I didn't just want to read through those. And so with that, if there's any questions or discussions you all would like to have, Tricia and I are happy to have a talk.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley. If you want to stop screen sharing, I'll be able to see everybody a little bit better.
You can do that.
And I am looking to my fellow commissioners to see if we have questions. Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the additional information today. I'm curious to know this pay-as-you-go kind of model.
Mm-hmm.
It's unclear to me how much annual revenue a well that's pulling less than 15 barrel equivalents every day makes in a year. And so if the pay-as-you-go is a 0.5% on the gross income, I think is what you said.
Gross
How
revenue.
long would it take someone who's running a stripper well to have enough amassed in an account that would cover the P&A and reclamation? And let's assume it's $30,000 to P&A. Let's pick $30,000. Your map goes anywhere from 10 to 100. Let's pick 30 just as a
Yep.
pretend number.
Yep. I like that number. And that's the number I've sort of been using in my valuations as I model this up. And so if you look at, okay, so to answer your question, if you were to look at all the wells in Colorado and sort of bucket them into, what wells are at higher risk of becoming orphan wells and what wells aren't, right? And that's sort of the green light, yellow light, red light buckets that we went through previously. You need it, if all those wells were to get dumped into an orphan well fund, you need about $60 million per year to be able to address those immediately. And using that 0.5% of gross revenue going into a fund, using just 2019 production data and assuming the state doesn't grow production and the state doesn't tank, you raise about $60 million per year. So I know your first question of how long does it take a stripper well to pay to plug itself at 0.5% per year of gross revenue? That's a really tough question to answer, right? Because there's stripper wells that make 2 barrels a day. It's going to take a real long time. And there's stripper wells that make 15 barrels a day where it'll take less time. And that complexity is why I think a sort of a statewide pooled approach where every well's in and every operator's in, and you can raise about $60 million a year is what's required to address those complexities. And so in general, I think the state needs to raise about $60 million a year initially, right? To be quote unquote financially secure against any sort of black swan, large stripper well event or large orphan well event.
Thanks.
Mr. Bradley, could you just answer the question? I mean, take the hypothesis of 15 barrels of BOE a day.
Sure.
What's the answer there? I mean,
Sure.
You said that's easier to accomplish than 2. Well, yeah, but just trying to run the numbers on something that is your example.
Yeah, I'm doing it right now.
And Commissioner Gonzalez, I saw you had a hand up as well. So,
So I'm going to say the margin, okay, after expenses on a typical stripper well is about $20 a barrel, okay? So if a well makes 15 BOE a day and the margin is $20 a barrel, that well's netting about $300 a day, okay? And so if you wanted to raise $30,000 divided by 300, it's 100 days. So a 15 BOE a day well can raise $30,000 in less than a year.
okay, thanks for that. Commissioner Gonzalez?
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Mr. Bradley. I got a question. How does the bonding interact with your proposal for this kind of pay-as-you-go pool?
How does the current bonding interact with our proposal? Is that the
The
question?
current bonding, or if there's any contemplated bonding associated with your proposal?
So the way we've talked about that is leave the current bonding regulations in place and add this on. But the intent is that this proposal would be the new financial assurance, right? And so I'm not assuming we enact one of these proposals and then on top of that, rules of $80,000 per well and bonding get layered on. The idea would be leave everything as is and layer one of these proposals on top of it.
Thank you. That answers that question. I guess my next question is it important that all operators participate in the pay-as-you-go fund? Or is there an opportunity for certain operators to participate through bonding of inactive wells, bonding of blankets and or well-specific bonds, and then some operators are pay-as-you-go because of the potentially prohibitive costs of bonding in the state?
So I typically, my brain migrates to the KISS principle, right? And so my typical instinct is keep it simple, everybody's in. But I absolutely think it could be logical and fair to have sort of an opt-in or opt-out if an operator wants to pick up a large cash bond, they could do that and opt out of a pay-as-you-go program. But my gut is keep it simple, everybody's in.
Does this? I'm just going to kind of piggyback on that. Let's say you got your 3 to 5 biggest operators opt out. Does your kind of financial model still hold in terms of the ability to to cover those potential orphan wells for the rest of the operators?
I haven't modeled a some operators are in, some operators are out type scenario. I could, and it's important to keep in mind that when you look at the numbers and the production, yes, the largest operators would be paying 80% of the money into the fund. But if you also look at inactive wells and inactive well counts, the largest operators also hold 80% of the inactive wells. And so they would be paying the most into the fund. They would also be utilizing it the most.
Thanks.
Commissioner Messner and then Commissioner Bowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a couple of questions, but I do want to kind of make a comment that, my understanding of this presentations today is that there were opportunities to answer a specific set of questions that we had asked and not really an opportunity to pitch new ideas around financial assurance or have a debate about that, because that's not an equitable way to handle this, right? We asked industry to answer specific questions and not pitch new ideas. So I'm hoping that presenters in the future, acknowledge that and just focus on the questions that were asked. And there were some questions that were asked specifically for small operators. And one of them was, how do you budget for plugging, abandoning, reclamating, remediating when a well is reaching the end of life? And what factors are considered when determining end of life? I don't think that you answered that in your presentation. Perhaps I missed it, but could you answer that?
Sure, and I appreciate that, and I understand that, Commissioner Messner. And I did submit responses to all those questions in writing a couple weeks ago, and I'll make sure that those did get circulated to you. So small operators have an annual capital budget. Okay, so we look at what the baseline requirements are for us to continue to produce our wells, and then we look at additional revenue on top of that, and we budget capital expenditures annually. Okay, and it's typically based off prices, right? What's the macro environment look like? And in good years, when prices are up and we have extra money coming in, we utilize and budget for additional capital expenditures to either do recompletes and extend the economic life of our wells that have declined to a point where they're not making money anymore, or to plug them. And so it's sort of a year by year, what's the macro environment look like situation, okay? And the regulations, the current regulations and even the past regulations make it very hard to just sit on large portfolios of wells that don't make money. So that's how most of our members handle it.
So is it fair to say that over a certain amount of time, you're generating or putting aside money to ultimately plug and abandon this particular well? So you're holding it separate as a line item in budgets, or you're addressing it at the end of life, or you're addressing it at the beginning of life? You know, what's the approach there to ensure that you've got adequate resources available to plug and abandon these assets at the determined end of life?
Yeah, so the answer is annually we look at budgets and we put funds in a bucket for either recompletes or P&As. And there's another motivation for us to do that, you know, besides the regulatory one, which is if you ever want to sell your portfolio, it's super hard to sell a portfolio that's full of wells that need to either be plugged or recompleted. You want to keep up with that portfolio, and if you can recomplete it and extend the economic life, you want to get it done. And if it needs to be plugged, you need to get it done.
And so then I think last question, and perhaps you answered this, but maybe I didn't hear it, but one of the questions that was asked is what factors or criteria go into determining whether to operate P&A a well or to sell it? And I think you kind of answered it already, but I wonder if you could elaborate on that. So one of the things that one of the things in your presentation that I think surprised me was that you've got the example of the well that's been operating for 40 years with an anticipated additional 40-year operating life. So, you know, if it's got another 40 years, what's the determination for when you will ultimately P&A that well?
So it always starts with geology, right? The de facto answer is always continue to operate if there's a way to do it in a profitable manner, okay? And so you formulate a forecast for prices, right? And then you look at the geology and you determine if there's formations and remaining reserves and productivity where you can continue to operate that well and make money. Okay, that's always the default answer. Can I recomplete it, improve the lifting, and continue to make money? If you can't, then it turns into, can I plug it? Okay, and the am I gonna keep the well or sell the well is typically pretty sporadic and just depends on the market. Okay, if I'm a small operator and I'm looking around and my neighbors started selling wells and they got good valuations, I may throw my hat in the ring, right? If they're not, I'm not gonna.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Bowe.
Thank you, Chair. And thanks, Mr. Bradley. And not to belabor the point on sort of new ideas here, but I just wanted to check the math on the example that Commissioner McGowan was speaking about with you. Am I wrong here? I think you said, you know, you clear $20 per barrel for a given stripper well, but wouldn't it be 0.5% of that we're theoretically setting aside for P&A? So just with this example of how long it takes to get to that $30,000, wouldn't it actually take, you know, 20,000 days essentially if you're only earning $1.50 to put towards P&A $300 worth of revenue per
Yeah,
day for 15 barrels a day. Does that make
and
sense?
perhaps I misunderstood the question. So let's look specifically at what you're asking at the 0.5% of gross revenue. Okay, so let's assume a $50 oil price and a $50 oil price and 15 barrels a day. So 15 times 50, right, is $750 a day in gross revenue. And then you take that times 0.005, 1/2 of 1%, and you're correct. That's $4 a day. So then you got to take $30,000 divided by 4, and it's 7,500 days.
Thanks. I just wanted to check on that.
Yep.
Other questions from commissioners for this panel? I'm not seeing anyone else. So with that, thank you, Mr. Bradley. Ms. Larson, I believe we're moving to the next component of the panel.
Yes, we will get those panelists in right now.
There's Carrie.
Bledge, I see that you are unmuted. Are you leading the presentation here?
I'm going to be kicking it off, Mr. Chair, and it looks like we have just about everyone here on the presentation side. I think the only one we're waiting for is Mr. Murphy.
Mr. Coleman, Mr. Matthews, yourself.
Yep, there we go. When you're ready, Mr. Chair. Or
Go for it.
yes, sir. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to address you today. COGA and API, along with West Slope COGA and the Energy Council, represent over 95% of production in this state and a significant number of the hardworking professionals who provide us with some of the cleanest molecules on the planet that produce the energy and everyday products we need. Our aim today, as Commissioner Messner alluded to, is respond to your questions you submitted as you consider revisiting the financial assurance rules. Our plan this morning is to take a deeper dive into the COGCC's data from its orphan well database. Our consultant, who many of you know, is Dave Coleman, who will kick off the presentation, starting a bit out of order by addressing question 6 first, better understand the profile of these particular wells, which we hope will provide you with some insights and shape the policy to come. Next, I'll reconvene the order with questions 1 to 3, and we'll hand over to Carrie Hackenberger and Jim Martin from API. Lastly, our counsel, Mark Matthews, will introduce our panel to assist with any follow-up questions. So with that, Dave, I'll turn it over to you and begin sharing my screen.
Thanks, Rich.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, thank you for your time today. Hopefully get to go out and enjoy this beautiful weather we're having.
All right, Dave, are we up?
Yep, go one more slide. So we are addressing question number 6, which is kind of a look back and try to figure out some of the characteristics of the wells that have become orphaned And can we gather information about how much that well was producing? So we're going to provide a little information about that. So one more, there you go. So we did review data on both the well and the operator of all the wells that were ever orphaned in Colorado. And this analysis was looking for trends that we were trying to look for these wells to see if we could predict why they might have become orphaned. And the trends that we analyzed were both well characteristics and operator characteristics, and both of those are important. It's important to note that all the source data for this analysis was COGCC data, either on your website or provided directly from staff. I have other slides I can provide after if you want to know more details on exactly where this data came from. I'm kind of a geek. Seems like you and me, Commissioner Mesner, are both geeks, so I can provide that if you'd like it. But I don't plan to present the details of it today. Next slide. So just a summary of the three trends, and we'll get into details of where these trends come from later in the presentation, but I just throw out the three trends where we found right now. The first two are related to well characteristics. In trend one, wells spud prior to 2000 made up a vast majority of the wells ever orphaned in Colorado, 91%. Trend two, also a well characteristic, wells with no production or especially low production, and we're talking about 2 BOE a day or less in recent years, so 2011 to 2020, made up most of the orphaned wells. And very important is trend number three, which is an operator characteristic. And operator compliance related trends existed for these former operators that had orphaned wells. These operators had a track record of generally being unresponsive to compliance issues. It's not necessarily that they had compliance issues, it's that they was unresponsive to them. Kind of backing up what Mr. Bradley said earlier about the bad apples, and we found the same thing in this analysis. And this is especially true for enforcement orders, MITs, and generally corrective actions. Next slide, Rich. So let's get into the well characteristics. One more slide. So COGCC provided us a list of every well ever orphaned in the state of Colorado that they know about, and that totaled 579 total. That's the total of all the wells ever orphaned. Some of these are ones that were orphaned decades ago and already plugged by the COGCC, and that becomes important when I get to the second bullet. So of those 579 wells, 525 or 91 of them were orphaned, were spud prior to 2000. So we're talking the last century. What we ended up doing is, oh, sorry, Rich. Yep. What we ended up doing is we tried to take a subset of that 579. And this is as of April 22nd, I believe. The COGCC was still actively working to plug 263 of those 579. All the others were already plugged. And those 263 were some of the more recently orphaned wells throughout the years. So what we wanted to do is, because that 579 number included wells that might have been plugged decades ago, we wanted to see if the same trends existed for the wells that were more recently orphaned. So that's the 263 number. And we determined that 229 of the 263, or 87%, of the more recently orphaned wells were spud prior to 2000. So it followed the same trend as all 579. So that's our first trend, which I already kind of said. If it's before 2000, it made up a vast majority, 91%. Next slide, Rich. We then looked at production data. So the COGCC's website has an access database for every year of production from 1999 to 2000. So we grabbed that production, we calculated a BOE, barrels of equivalent, and that formula is basically gas production for the year in MCF divided by 6, and then you add that to the oil production in barrels that the well produced. So we did those calculations to get a BOE per year. So what we found was all 579 of these wells ever orphaned either had no production, in the vast majority of them had no production since 2011, or had an average yearly production from the more recent time periods of 2011 to 2020 that was below that formal stripper well status of 15 BOE a day. And when you multiply 15 by 365, you get 5,475. More specifically, though, diving into that number a little bit more, we see the range was 0 to 3,457. So what that shows is wells that are doing 15 BOE a day or 14 or maybe even up to 10, they don't typically seem to be the problem. It's those wells a little bit lower on that stripper well category seem to be the issue in these wells. The second bullet, of the wells that had production. So what we did on this bullet is we took out the wells that had no production, and we only focused on wells that had production from 2011 to 2020. The average yearly production of these wells was 680 BOE a year, or about 2 BOE a day, showing that, you know, the ones that actually had production, it was a very low number. It wasn't the 15, it wasn't the 10, it was the 2. And the last number, the last bullet, what we tried to do is say, hey, what was the max of each of these wells from 1999 to 2020? What was the best year that they had in those, out of those 22 years in BOE? And we found that only 19 of the 573, or 3 of them, had anything higher than 5,475, with the highest being 17,000 wells, 17,000 BOE for one of those wells in 2008. Next slide, Rich. So we did analysis on those 263 subset of the more recently orphaned one, just to make sure the trends were following. Just a note on these 579 wells. I said earlier, most had no production. Well, it was about 354 had no production since 99. So this tells us that several of these wells were orphaned a while ago, and most likely were plugged by the COGCC even before 99. That's why we did this analysis on these 263. And when we did the analysis on the 263, those same trends that we found in the previous slide existed in those 263. So that led us to trend number 2, wells with no production or especially low production, the 2 BOE a day or less, in recent years made up most of the orphaned wells. Next slide, Rich. So the question did hit, like, what was the well doing in the preceding years before it became orphaned? And I understand exactly why, commissioners, you want to know that. Unfortunately, it's a little hard to know that. And I think the biggest issue is when a well becomes orphaned, there's no status in COGCC that says the well became orphaned this time period, like this date. You can go through enforcement orders and stuff, but it's still hard because let's say a well is shut in for a couple of years, and then let's say 2016, it's shut in, and it goes through 16 and 17 shut in. Finally, you know, the operator's non-responsive, and in 2018, the COGCC does formal enforcement against them and then makes it an orphan well in 2018. Throughout that whole time period, from 2016 to 2018, the status is still shut in. It's SI. It doesn't change. It only changes when COGCC then plugs the well, then it'll change the plug. So there's no orphaned well status that they can say, hey, in 2018, it's orphaned now, or even in 2016. So it's hard to really get an estimate of when the well officially went orphaned. So we did go through enforcement order data, and we have for some of these operators, we have a formal enforcement date, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's the date it was orphaned. It could have essentially been orphaned a year or two before without that formality, because it's just sitting there and nothing's happening. So it was really hard. But with that said, next slide, Rich. We took some of the more recent enforcement actions against 6 operators, former operators, and that's Red Mesa, Benchmark, PetroShare, CM, Monument Global, and Energy Search. And those 6 operators had 186 of those 579 orphaned wells, or 32% of them that were ever orphaned, belonged to one of these 6 former operators. We grabbed the year that these wells went orphaned simply from the enforcement order. If the enforcement order was in 2018, we used that year. If it was in 2017, we used that year. That's the best guess we had. And it could be misleading based on what I've said earlier, but that's what we did on this. And then what we did is, let's say if the year was 2018, we looked at the previous 3 years from that. And some of these operators had different years, so they had different years we looked at them. So of these 186 wells, what we found is 121 of them, or about 65%, had no production for the previous 3 years from that enforcement order. And most of them were in either SI or TA status, shut in or temporarily abandoned. 65 wells, or 35, had production in at least one of those 3 years. I don't think many of them had them in all 3 years, but they had it in at least 1 or 2 of the years. And they were under that 15 BOE a day. But again, like the other analysis showed, it was far below the 15. It was the most anyone ever had was 3,037 BOE in a year, and many were below that. So that again shows it's not so much the 15 number, it's a number less than 15. So those were well characteristics. So very important. Next slide. Operator characteristics, and this is very important, as Mr. Bradley touched on earlier. Operator compliance. What we did is we had some people look at the compliance history of 12 of the former operators that had the most orphaned wells. So the operators with the 12 operators with the highest number of these 579 wells. We did compliance research on them to the extent that the information is available. And they made up, those 12 made up 265 or 46% of all of those 579 orphaned wells. And the analysis showed some trends. So number one, they all had outstanding corrective actions from violations, or 11 of the 12 did, and they just weren't responsive. 9 of the 12 had MIT issues, again, not responsive. It's not the fact that they had the MIT issues, it's the fact that they were non-responsive on those. 6 of the 12 had some bankruptcy issues or were otherwise insolvent, and 5 of the 12 had bonding issues. Particularly, they weren't fulfilling the excess inactive well bonding at the time when COGCC staff would request additional increased bonding. So trend 3, which is very important, is operator compliance related trends existed for these former operators, and they had a track record of just being unresponsive to these compliance issues. Next slide, Rich. Next slide, Rich. There you go. Oh, other way. One more. There we go. So the 3 green on the top are the exact same. I don't need to repeat them again. But what we wanted to do is show you the table there. There are a total of almost 84,494 wells spud in the history of Colorado. And you can see the breakout between spud prior to 2000 and spud now. And the reason I broke it out that way is because of trend 1 showing the vast majority of them were orphaned before 2000. And then you have the number of wells that were ever orphaned, the 579. And you can see the very, very low percentage of wells that have become orphaned in the state. Even those that fulfill those well characteristics, they were spud prior to 2000 and they had low production numbers. You can still see a very low percent of wells have been orphaned. So, one other point on that 84,494 wells, we hear now that there's less than 50,000 active wells in the state now. That just goes to show that the operators have plugged almost as many wells in the history of Colorado than are active right now. But this table really does show a small number of these wells have become orphaned. And my final slide on the conclusion, Rich, if you want to get to that, is the true risk of becoming an orphan well is not just a well. I mean, you have those characteristics, those 2 well characteristics I showed you, but just because wells have that doesn't mean it's becoming orphaned. The table I showed earlier shows that there's going to be a lot of those out there, but operators are working and doing that. So it's not the well itself, but more critically, if the operator has compliance issues and are unwilling to address these issues, that's when the risk really seems to elevate up and ensure to have a big red flag on the commission and everyone that something needs to be done with this operator in these wells, because they have an operator that's not listening and they have these well characteristics. And as a previous slide shows, there are many Colorado operators that do operate these older, low producing wells. However, the orphaned well risk is low because the operators are doing their thing. They're responsible, they're taking care of them. When an issue comes up, they're addressing the issue. So that's what the analysis shows from a well characteristic and an operator characteristic for question 6. Back to you, Rich.
Thanks, Dave. And we'll reconvene back to question 1. And what are the reasons for an operator may shift well status from idle to active periodically throughout the year? The short answer is there's a host of reasons. First, as Executive Director Murphy flagged, Idle is not an issue that's defined in the rules, so we're assuming this means inactive or shut in. But that said, a simple answer is that a well could be put into inactive or shut in status to address any maintenance issues or a workover. Once these issues have been addressed or updated, the well will be put back into active status. Another reason serves as a safety precaution and to comply with activity at a nearby well. If that well is being fracked, operators can temporarily put their well or their wells into inactive or shut-in status until that activity is completed or given the all clear. Lastly, operators may also face fluctuations in commodity prices, as we saw last year with the COVID-19 lockdown. Obviously, this was an extreme circumstance, but other fluctuations throughout the years also precipitated similar needs to PA wells, but bring them back online in accordance with their lease agreements and contractual obligations. Question 2, how do you budget for P&A when a well is reaching end of life, and what factors are considered when determining end of life? As operators have developed and executed their business models, some have front-ended their plug and reclaim budgets, as Commissioner Messner said, while others set aside plug and reclaim dollars as production decreases in the well. It's these options that operators need depending on their capital obligations and contractual lease agreements, which has worked in Colorado over the past few decades. Operators consistently monitor a well's output, and once the wells begin to decrease their production, they'll need to begin to forecast the end of production. Operators will consider the economic costs and production level needed to continue to offset any routine maintenance costs or other operational costs. As these forecasted revenues and expenditures tighten, operators will move to plug and reclaim those wells. In question 3, examples of operators operating at low production vertical well locations that they want to use for a new horizontal well, but when approached to sell, the current operator will not sell. Obviously, we don't want to get into discussing rare hypothetical situations such as this. Additionally, this likely falls outside financial assurance discussions because it deals with negotiations between operators or an operator and another party. It's difficult to identify the low producing operator's economic position or its long-term plans. That may not translate to an asking price for the purchaser, for example. But as we stated before, for new horizontal wells or area development plans, operators are willing to engage with the COGCC to address orphaned wells in the area and plug and reclaim those wells, working with the COGCC staff. Next, I'll go to Carrie for question 4.
Thanks, Rich.
Mhm.
Good morning, commissioners. Thank you for having us today. My name is Carrie Hackenberger, and I'm an associate director for American Petroleum Institute, Colorado. Today, I'll be answering question 4 and question 5, and then turning it over to Jim Martin to round our presentation out. Question number 4 was, are there other incentives for plugging wells? We have surveyed our members to better understand what the reasons or advantages are for plugging wells, and there are a host of reasons for doing this. And while many operators P&A their wells before the end of their useful life, this is nuanced based on the operator, and it is important to recognize that for many operators in the state of Colorado, stripper wells or low producing wells are part of their business models, and that does not suggest that those wells are at risk of being orphaned. Many operators on the western slope or on the eastern plains may operate their wells for longer than may be the case in the DJ Basin. With that being said, particularly in the DJ Basin, plugging and abandoning older wells allows for a more robust long-term development program. Additionally, many operators will plug older wells if they feel they may be at risk for potential future issues from aging wells and infrastructure, and it may make more sense to simply P&A them from an operational perspective rather than perform maintenance and continue producing that well. Next slide, Rich. Question 5 was, is it possible to estimate production for a year of an active producing well? What might be the reasons that the projected amount would differ from actual in a look back, and how frequently does this occur? Forecasting or estimating well production varies by operators, but it is a continuous exercise. After a well is drilled and brought into production, operators can generally get a sense of yearly production after the first 90 days and to typically develop an annual forecast from that. They may use similarly situated nearby operations and may utilize a decline curve analysis. A decline curve analysis is a means of predicting future production based on past production history. As I mentioned, though, this is a continuous exercise. There are many factors that can influence projected production values, such as shutting in a well for maintenance. And because of this, forecasting is a continuous exercise and operators are regularly reevaluating. I'll now turn it over to Jim Martin to round us out.
Good morning, Chair Robbins, Commissioners. As Carrie said, my name is Jim Martin. I'm outside counsel for API Colorado. It's been a while. It's great to see you all again. My job today, as Carrie mentioned, is to briefly walk through our answers to questions 7 and 8, and then I can turn the microphone over to Mr. Matthews, who can introduce our panelists. And Rich, you've already got question 7 up, so great. In question 7, the commissioner's question seems to focus on the cost drivers for plugging, abandoning, and reclaiming a well or well site. It probably won't surprise you that this isn't an easy question to answer. It does appear that vertical depth of a well bore is a key driver for plugging and abandonment costs. But it's important to note that the total cost of a site will include costs of site restoration. The plugging and abandonment costs themselves will be a percentage of the total costs, but those total costs will vary from well to well, and the percentage of plugging and abandonment as opposed to site reclamation will change depending upon the site. A well site, for example, on flatlands with topsoil that's been maintained at the site will be a lot different, a lot less expensive probably from an old site on steep lands where topsoil wasn't retained at the site. There's a host of different variables at work here and a host of different potential scenarios. But in short, there's a lot of variability in costs and cost drivers. Other factors will be type of well, for example, a shallow CBM well or a dry gas well is going to be a lot different than a deep horizontal well in the DJ Basin. But that's a quick overview for question 7. Rich, if you could move us to question 8. And there's question 8. Your last question had a different focus. What are the, and I'm paraphrasing here, what are the criteria operators use when deciding to plug and abandon a well or making other decisions about that well? And you're probably tired of hearing this, but it's complicated. And that's basically my message here. First of all, different operators will make different decisions. Different fields will pose different questions and different criteria. But by that I mean a DJ operator may use different criteria than, say, a Peance operator. A Peance operator may literally run a well for substantially longer than would a DJ operator. A large company versus a company for which low producing wells is a sustainable business model are going to approach these questions differently as well. So in short, the criteria will be well, operator, and field specific. Having said that, we can identify some of the criteria that an operator might use, likely will use. Most important probably is the health of the well. If there are integrity concerns for all operators, that well is going to move to the top of the queue for plugging and abandonment and then site restoration. An operator obviously is going to look at the well operations and maintenance costs as well as revenue in making a cut at whether the well should be plugged and abandoned, worked over, or maintained. An operator is going to have to ask whether a well is holding a lease for a lease that's scheduled to be developed but isn't yet in the queue. An operator is going to ask whether there are some community benefits to plugging and abandoning and reclaiming a well or well site. There's no doubt plenty of other criteria, but these are the ones that we heard most from operators as we were preparing for this informational hearing. And with that, I'd like to turn our presentation over to Mr. Matthews, who's going to introduce our panelists to you.
Yeah. Good morning. Mark Matthews, as Jim Martin said, outside counsel to COGA. We anticipated you would have a number of questions following up on our initial presentation to those 8 questions. So in addition to Dave Coleman, Rich Coolidge, Carrie Hackenberger, and Jim Martin, we've added to our answer panel, if you will, 4 operators, representatives, 3 from the DJ Basin and 1 from the West Slope. They are Kim Cook from Oxy, Chad Calvert from Chevron, Brian Koshier from PDC, and Jeff Kirtland from Terra Energy. And we are all happy to be as responsive as possible to any follow-up questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Matthews, Mr. Martin, the rest of the panel. I really appreciate the presentation and appreciate the focus on answering the enumerated questions that we had asked. In particular, I want to thank Mr. Coleman for his data-driven approach. That was very interesting with the trends that were identified as a result of that. I know you've done a good job over the years of being a geek with data, and you did a good job this morning, so thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Looking to my fellow commissioners for questions. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the presenters. That was super helpful. So I appreciate answering the questions and particularly Mr. Coleman for diving into some of the details there. So Mr. Coleman, based on that analysis and some of the trends that you were highlighting there, I did have some questions as far as like production, and it was clear, I think, from the trends in your analysis that 2 BOE to 0 BOE is certainly danger zone, right? And I think the Small Operator Society showed an example of a well that was, in existence for 40 years, and with different techniques for restimulating the well. It was ranging anywhere from, and I don't remember it exactly, but let's say it was ranging from 10 BOE to 15 BOE, or perhaps a little higher at times, but it was fluctuating, through the initial 40 years. I guess in that decline curve, as you're looking at stripper wells and you're looking at some of these situations where it might drop down into that danger zone, whether that's 5 BOE or less, or whatever you determine that may be. I mean, what is that projected timeline? And I know the answer is geology, and I know the answer, it depends, but I mean, generally speaking, I mean, if we're talking about a well that's 40 years old and may have another 40 year of life, I mean, how do you determine when it's going to drop down into that, that danger zone?
Yeah, that's a tough question, Commissioner, and I know you don't want to hear that, but it is really hard. If you have a well that's been producing for 40 years and it's in the 10 to 15 for several of those 30 years, I'm assuming it was producing more in the beginning of the well. And if it's holding steady, I mean, is it going to start dropping into the 5 and the 2 and 5 years, 7 years? I mean, it is going to depend on the reservoir, how depleted is that reservoir? So the answer is some will go pretty quickly and some will not. And I think it's going to be very dependent on the well itself.
And I wonder, is there a threshold where, generally speaking, an operator determines that it's uneconomic as far as BOE? I mean, is it 10? Is it 5? Is it 2? Is there a threshold there that it really can't be economic for anyone to operate that well?
I think a lot of that will also be on the practices of the operator. I mean, some operators can produce wells a little bit cheaper, just and not saying that they're taking shortcuts. I'm not suggesting that at all, but just the way they're structured, they can operate wells at a lower cost, giving the same level of protection than other operators. So it is dependent, and it's also dependent on some operators are just going to say, look, we've got bigger wells. These wells are more important to us. So I'm not going to worry about these smaller wells. So let's just plug them now. So our level is $10 because they're not as important to us as some of these bigger wells we have, where smaller operators may say, hey, those are our wells and those are important to us. So we're not going to plug them because they are economic to us in our business models. So it's really going to depend on the operator.
I appreciate that. And generally I have a lot more questions, but that presentation was very thorough. So I appreciate that. And those are all the questions I have.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Other questions from commissioners? Commissioner McGowan?
Not necessarily sure it needs to be answered today, but I would be curious to know if we know that there are some warning signs or red flags for certain types of operators or wells, perhaps the commission needs to have some sort of performance evaluation based on those kind of red flags and what that might look like, so that we could have a discussion with an operator who has some of these red flags. And so I find it very, I find the kind of, here red flags that we have or we see before something kind of goes sideways, I find that very compelling. And I think there maybe is a role for the commission to stay on top of that before it gets to that situation.
Great comment, and I tend to agree with that, Commissioner McGowan. Looking back at some of the slides here, true risk of becoming an orphan well is not just a well, but more critically, if the operator has compliance issues or is unwilling to address well issues. I think that does mandate us looking into reviewing operator performance. Other questions? I'm not seeing any, and I think that just means that those who spoke did a good job. So appreciate the rest of you showing up and being available for questions, but we're not seeing additional questions at this point. So with that, I think we will zoom away the panel and we'll get ready for our next presentation, which is the PDC energy variance request. And why don't we, it's 10:30, why don't we take 10 minutes, get PDC up and running for this next presentation and come back at 10:40. Hello, folks. It is 10:40, and we will reconvene at this point in time the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission hearing on May 26th. And so with that, I think I would look to Hearings Manager Larson to frame the next agenda item, which is the PDC variance request.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Next on your agenda is docket number 210-2000012. It is a variance application from PDC Energy Incorporated. They are seeking a variance and order approving a Rule 314D5, stay of final action on OGDPs and DSUs within their forthcoming proposed comprehensive area plan lands. So we will be hearing from Mr. Joe Pershala. Mr. Lepore is also representing PDC, and he is in the meeting as a panelist and available to speak to their application. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Pershala, who will lead the presentation.
Mr. Pershala.
Thank you, Ms. Larson. Good morning, Mr. Chair. Good morning, commissioners. I see some familiar faces and some new faces. It's been a while since I've had an opportunity to present to you. Again, my name is Joe Pershala with the law firm Wellborn, Sullivan, Meck & Tooley. He is my co-counsel, Matt Lepore of Insight Energy Law, and together we represent PDC Energy in this matter. We are very excited and proud to be here today to present PDC's application, which is the first in the state of Colorado to initiate the comprehensive area plan process under Rule 314. You know, this application is really the first step of this process in preparing and filing a complete CAP application to the commission. The application requests that the commission grant a Rule 502A variance to Rule 314D5 and implement a stay of final action by the commission on all oil and gas development plan and drilling and spacing unit applications filed by any owners that include the lands identified in PDC's proposed CAP acreage, which covers certain lands in Township 4 North, ranges 65, 66, and 67 West, and Township 5 North, ranges 66 and 67 West, Weld County, Colorado, and that are more fully described on the Exhibit A1 to the application. Now, to be clear, the application does not seek to enjoin other owners from filing applications. It's only that the commission would withhold final action on any of those applications until after PDC's CAP application is decided by the commission. All owners within the CAP, now those affected by this variance application, were sent notice of the application itself. And owners is including those with the right to drill, meaning unleased mineral owners and working interest owners, i.e. leasehold owners. In addition to direct notice, PDC published notice in 2 papers of general circulation, the Greeley Tribune and the Denver Daily Journal. And moreover, publication was made for 5 consecutive weeks in the Denver Daily Journal as required by statute and rule to provide notice to 2 unleased mineral owners for whom no address could be found. In total, notice was sent to over 470 owners within the CAP application lands. PDC has met and discussed this application with its largest working interest partners that are in the CAP area, and those partners have expressed support for this application. In addition, we have 2 letters of support from 2 local governments, that is the City of Greeley and the City of Evans, that have been filed in this docket. And those are the local governments with jurisdiction over where the actual locations for development of this CAP would be cited. There have been no petitions, no objections, or protests submitted in this matter. Thus, this application is uncontested. In addition, the director has reviewed this application and she has issued a well-reasoned recommendation, concluding that PDC has satisfied the 5 elements under Rule 502C for a variance to issue. The director's recommendation encourages the commission to approve the application and, as relevant to today's hearing, include a condition of approval that PDC provide bi-monthly, that is every other month, updates to the commission on PDC's progress in it developing its CAP application, and then throughout the CAP process up to the Commission's final decision on the application itself. We agree with the Director's analysis, and we ask that the Commission, based on the merits of the application, grant this requested Rule 502A variance and implement a stay on final action by the Commission on all OGDP and DSU applications until after the Commission decides PDC's CAP application. Now, following the Commission's decision on this variance application, and should the Commission grant the application, we do have a representative of PDC available today to provide you with that first status update. And with that, I would turn the floor over to Mr. Lepore, and he will walk you through the application and the 5 elements under Rule 502C that support the granting of the variance. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, we'll look for Mr. Lepore to unmute and work through the 5 elements that are necessary for us in consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Commissioners. Thank you, Mr. Prashala. My video doesn't seem to be on, and I don't know if that's on my end or your end. It may not matter that much. I did actually bathe this morning, so it's unfortunate. Let me begin. Let's see what this says. There we go. All right. Commissioners, I'd like to start by talking a little bit about the purpose of a comprehensive area plan. What you have said is that a comprehensive area plan can avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts to public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources in a region through systematic planning of infrastructure location, best management practices, and centralizing facilities. PDC agrees. I am here today to represent PDC, of course, but I am also here as an advocate of comprehensive area plannings, whether we call them CDPs or CAPs or something else. In my opinion, and based on my experience, CAPs are the best tool in your toolbox to minimize the impacts of oil and gas development and maximize protection of public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. Among the benefits of the centralized planning afforded by a CAP are: it allows an operator to select the very best surface locations, in this case, across an area of 50 square miles. It provides the best opportunity for electric utility providers to bring highline power to oil and gas locations through a combination of economies of scale and developmental certainty. It eliminates the spectacle that more than one midstream operator will build pipelines to serve different oil and gas operators in the same location. And it presents the opportunity to eliminate and evaluate and minimize cumulative impacts on a large scale. None of those advantages pertain to well pad by well pad development that has dominated development in Colorado for years. CAP development is not always going to be possible, given the dispersed mineral ownership across the state. I urge the Commission to take advantage of the opportunities for CAP development when they come along, as they are here with PDC. So let me now turn to the purposes of a Rule 314 D5 stay. As the Director's recommendation points out, the Commission intended Rule 314 D5 to add additional incentive for operators to file CAP applications. The Commission intended to strongly encourage operators to submit CAPs wherever possible because of the significant benefits that landscape level planning provide, those that I've just gone through. From PDC's perspective, your intentions are exactly right, but your timing is a little off. So I'd like to talk for a minute about where PDC is today with its CAP application. For the past 6 months, PDC has worked diligently and has invested tremendous time and resources, both human and capital, planning and beginning to implement the following things: a large-scale cumulative impacts analysis led by a world-class expert consulting firm, the beginning to design and develop the midstream infrastructure across that large area that would service solely PDC. They have performed multiple site location analyses to identify the optimal surface locations across that CAP area. They have engaged with all of the relevant local and proximate local governments within the CAP boundary. They have engaged with Xcel Energy and Poudre Valley REA about bringing highline power to the locations that they have planned, so that those locations can be powered by electricity, the drilling operations, and the production operations. All of that has been done over the last 6 months before the CAP application is even filed. And PDC estimates it likely needs another 6 months to finish that pre-application process. Without a stay in place, later today, tomorrow morning, or next week, sometime thereafter, another operator can file a competing drilling and spacing unit or oil and gas development plan inside the CAP boundary and potentially turn all of PDC's work and planning upside down. I think it's important for you to understand that even a small OGDP within that CAP boundary can be incredibly disruptive to all of the groundwork, all of the legwork that PDC has put into this, that is sort of that pinnacle of the CAP, the comprehensive development where everything fits together and works together. For PDC, the business risk that their pre-application time and effort will be undercut or eliminated entirely by one or more other operators filing individual OGDPs within the CAP is unacceptable. We suspect that future CAP applicants will feel the same. So with that, let me turn to the 5 elements that are required under 502A. Those 5 elements are the operator has made a good faith effort to comply or is unable to comply with the specific requirements, in this case contained in the rule, that the requested variance will not violate the basic intent of the act, that the requested variance is necessary to avoid any undue hardship, that granting the variance will not result in net adverse impacts to public health, safety, welfare, the environment, or wildlife resources, and that the requested variance contains reasonable conditions of approval or other mitigation measures to avoid, minimize, mitigate adverse impacts. PDC believes that it has met each of those elements, as Mr. Prashala said, and Director Murphy has reached the same conclusion. So I will talk a little bit about each, maybe more about some than others. The first element is that PDC has made a good faith effort to comply or is unable to comply with the specific requirements contained in the Commission's rule. I have articulated for you all the work that PDC has already done and the time and effort and resources it has invested in this pre-application process. All of that without a safety net, with no assurance whatsoever that another operator, a competitor, will not come in, file an OGDP, and spoil those comprehensive development plans that PDC has invested so much time and effort into. On that basis, I would argue that PDC has made a good faith effort to pursue its CAP application. And as I mentioned, it has another 6 months to go, approximately, where it has that same business risk exposure while it continues to invest time, effort, and resources into just getting the CAP application in front of you. PDC has demonstrated the commitment to the CAP, and it is deserving of protection from encroachment by other operators that the state provides, and it deserves that incentive that you talked about, the incentive to encourage operators to develop in this manner when they have that opportunity. I would also argue that PDC is unable to comply with 314D5 in the sense that we've talked about. It makes increasingly little business sense for it to continue down this path without a stay in place. Potentially, it could elect to forego the CAP option entirely due to the risk that that effort will be thwarted by competing operators. Other operators considering a cap in the future may also be wary of proceeding without the benefit of the cap stay in place at some point during this pre-application process, rather than after the cap application is filed and deemed to be complete by the operator, which is still a little bit of a black box, right? We don't know how long that process takes. Regular old OGDPs are clearly taking a while to get through the completion process. And this is on a much, much, much larger scale than a regular OGDP. As Director Murphy put it in her recommendation, the Commission's express preference for cap development as a tool to address cumulative impacts and minimize surface impacts through landscape level planning warrants some flexibility in the timing of the stay contemplated by Rule 315 D5. Accordingly, she found that PDC has made a good faith effort to comply or is unable to comply with Rule 314 D5. I just want to kind of add one thing here. From my perspective, if I did sort of a rough cost benefit analysis, the cost to the Commission of approving the stay at this time is, as near as I can tell, virtually zero. And I say that because no one has protested. As Mr. Pashala told you, everyone has been notified, no one has protested, and you can approve the stay. And the upside of that is tremendous. The upside is all of those benefits of cap development that we've talked about. The statement of basis and purpose is quite eloquent about Rule 314 D5 providing an incentive for operators to pursue cap development. And I think the reality on the ground, as we've discovered over these 6 months, is that PDC needs the incentive now, when every day it continues to invest in the cap is another day that its efforts could be thwarted by other operators. The second condition is the variance will not violate the basic intent of the Act. Granting the stay, in our opinion, will accomplish the Commission's directives, further the legislative declaration, and also avoid the pitfalls of a race to the permit. On these grounds, the Director found that the stay would not violate the basic intent of the Act, and we agree. The requested variance, condition number 3, the requested variance is necessary to avoid undue hardship. I think we've articulated for you what those hardships are. The pre-application process is arduous, lengthy, lots of resources devoted to it, and all of that could go for naught in the absence of a stay. The fourth element is granting the variance will result in no net adverse impacts to public health, safety, welfare, the environment, or wildlife resources. We clearly believe that granting the stay will ultimately have a net adverse benefit to all of those factors by virtue of the benefits of the cap development. And finally, the requested variance contains reasonable conditions of approval or other mitigation measures to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse impacts. In one sense, we actually feel that this requested variance is functionally ministerial. It does change the timing of the stay somewhat, but it will not have adverse impacts to public health, safety, welfare. But the condition of approval that we've agreed to, and I think it is important, I think this is a really important check and balance, if you will, is that PDC will provide you with periodic updates on the status of its planning and development. So as we go forward from here, starting right after this, if you approve the stay, PDC will provide updates on its progress so you can check in and see, is this developing? Is this going to come to fruition? And if at some point you determine that it's stalled or that it is no longer the best option for some reason, you will have the opportunity to revisit that stay. I will stop there. I thank you for your time and attention, and we are happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lepore. Thank you, Mr. Pashala, for the presentation. Before we turn to questions, I have a question for our AAG Davenport, if he could show his kind self. Thank you, Mr. Davenport. Just getting to that last point made by Mr. Lepore, if the commission were to approve the stay, and if the commission were to receive these bi-monthly reports, it's not saying we're going to do this, but the commission would have the prerogative to reconsider the stay down the road if it felt like the stay is no longer meeting these 5 elements or is no longer, appropriate given lack of moving forward, et cetera. I just want to kind of clarify that point before we get into the merits.
Yes, I think that's accurate, Mr. Chair. Also, the recommended order that you have before you, if the commission would like to clarify that it intends to reserve that right, you can make an edit to that recommended order clarifying that provision as well.
That's sort of a right that exists with the commission with regard to any action we take. Is that, I mean, other than something that grants sort of a vested right to, to some entitlement, which this is not doing. This is just putting a stay in place so that they can continue down the road for consideration of the cap.
Generally, that's accurate, yes.
Okay, I don't know that we need a clarification to the recommended order. I think this clarification in the record here today would serve for that. So with that, look to my fellow commissioners for questions. Commissioner Messner's hot and ready to go. Raise his hand quick. You were close, Ms. McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just actually wanted to follow up on your points, Mr. Chair, with AAG Davenport. Because one of the things, I mean, I actually appreciate the spirit of the variance and the reasons behind it. I find them, compelling. I did have a couple of questions, though, as far as timing. And so, Chair Robbins, you indicated, and I think AAG Davenport agreed that we would be able to revisit this. That is a legal right of the commission. If that's true, what type of finding would the commission need to have in order to determine that the applicant wasn't abiding by their variance approval?
AAG Davenport.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner Messner. Looking into a crystal ball a little bit on that, it would depend on the circumstances. Certainly, I think you would have to find a change in circumstances that the original purposes of granting the variance were no longer existed. And I can think of one example, that if after receiving an update, the commission determined that PDC had simply stopped pursuing its cap application, either based on PDC's own admission or based on questioning of PDC, it didn't appear that they had done any work on the cap application in a time period that you felt was too extensive, the commission could then withdraw the stay. That's just one example, hypothetical, but overall, I think you'd need to make some finding that the original purpose of the stay, the original circumstances that you granted the stay, or this variance and this resulting stay no longer existed.
Okay, thank you. I did have a couple other questions kind of along this line as well. And Mr. Lepore, I mean, certainly interested in your thoughts on this, and then perhaps Director Murphy as well. But my understanding is the existing variance request and the recommendation from the director don't include any kind of associated timeline or not to exceed as far as the cap application having a completion determination. I understand that once we begin the review process, there's no control from the applicant as far as timelines associated, but there's some control by the applicant prior to that completion or the submittal of the cap application. And I wonder whether it would be appropriate or helpful to have a not to exceed. I think Mr. Lepore, you indicated that approximately 6 months to finish the cap application. Obviously, there's some review by staff to determine completion. that may or may not be associated in the 6 months that you indicated. But in order to create a bookend on this, I wonder if not to exceed 1 year for completion determination may be appropriate. And it may not be appropriate, understanding that these bi-monthly updates may give us the opportunity to review and revisit the stay if we see problems. But this is just something that I'm thinking about right now.
May I respond, Mr. Chair?
Yeah, Mr. Lepore.
Thank you, Commissioner. Appreciate the question. Appreciate the thought process. I would echo your thoughts about the periodic updates as a good check and balance on that. I will say, as we've indicated right now, PDC is best estimate is something along the lines of 6 months to get the application into the commission. I will also say that 6 months ago, they thought it would take 6 months. So unexpected things arise. We're all in new territory to some extent. As recently as the last couple of weeks, PDC had to extend that sort of time frame based on a meeting with staff and a clarification of kind of staff's expectations about some of the required elements of the CAP application. So there's a bit of fluidity there. We wouldn't want to be tied to something too stringent. So I think I'll stop there, but I think that those periodic updates would be an opportunity to keep a tab, keep an eye on that.
Follow-up?
No, I'm good right now. Thank you.
Mr. McGowan, I believe you had your hand up. And for the record, I would like to note that we do have Commissioner Nanjapa, who joined us at the beginning of this presentation, so that we got the full slate of commissioners here with us. Commissioner McGowan, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Mesner asked many of the questions are the questions that I was thinking about. And I just wanted to clarify that the request for this variance, the notification has gone out to all the mineral owners and the relevant local governments that would be affected by this, correct?
Mr. Pizzarello?
Yes, so the notice went to the owners, that is those with the right to drill. So just for clarity, when we say mineral owners, we're not talking about royalty owners, those that are subject to an oil and gas lease, but those that are unleased, and then lessees, the working interest owners, who also would have the right to drill. They're the only two classification of owners that would be entitled to file an application and thus would be affected by this variance. As to the government question, notice both to the relevant local governments, but also to the proximate local governments.
Thank you, Mr. Pizzarello. Commissioner Gonzalez?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll start off with a quick comment. I think anyone who listened to our deliberations on this rule during the rulemaking knows that, you know, I have some concerns about stays, about specifically indefinite stays, and really just kind of the elimination of opportunities for other operators to participate in the CAP area. You know, that's coupled with the benefits that come with the CAPs, of which I understand the incentive associated with the stays to achieve those benefits. So kind of outlining that, you know, as we move forward with these check-ins, and as we move forward with this 6-month planning kind of time frame for submittal of the application, I'm going to have high expectations that PDC is going to be coming and showing substantial progress along the way, and that we, you know, we're aggressive at achieving that 6-month submittal timeline. I also appreciate that the engagement with the other working interest owners within the CAP area, and that this CAP, this variance application is coming uncontested. It shows that there was some engagement along the way, and that there is some support from the other operators within the area. And I also appreciate that this is not a stay on accepting of permits or OGDP applications, but rather a stay on final agency action on those permits. and so I appreciate that allows other operators to come in and fulfill what they're trying to accomplish in the area. So those are kind of my comments, first of all, and then that's going to be followed up with a question I think it may be posed best to Director Murphy, is what happens to applications that are submitted during this stay, if any?
Director Murphy?
That's an excellent question, and I'm probably going to hit more the legal question than like process. Like in that, staff will essentially stop processing something that is in process or has been submitted.
I think what I'm getting at is yeah, I mean, they won't process it, but it will be there. Will it be a placeholder? Will that operator then have an opportunity to execute on that application should PDC not fulfill, their application of the cap, or should anything happen with the cap, it be denied? Just trying to figure out what happens to those, and if there's some sort of rights associated with those operators kind of having a queue should everything fall apart in what's being contemplated here.
Commissioner, I think that having a system in our application, because especially with the mission change rules, we no longer are raced to the permit state. Because you have an application in doesn't mean that you first can jump in front of anybody else who submits an application after you. And that's a framework question to say that even if there is an application in, it doesn't have any special rights in our system or abilities, right? It notes for anybody who's interested in how those minerals and those surface may be developed, that there is activity that's under consideration. But staff is going to be, let's zoom to the Piance Basin, for example, just to make sure that I don't confuse anybody about what we're talking about for PDC. If we had two competing applications, staff is going to look at the one that seems best protective, right, and move that forward. And so to me, if we're in a situation where PDC at some point elects to no longer pursue the cap, the applications that were pending for those lands would, come up and be available to be reviewed by staff. And if something were appropriate, move forward with it. Does that help at all? Like it's kind of a convoluted answer.
Well, it was kind of a poorly worded question, so that helps a lot. And I definitely acknowledge, that it's not first in time, first in right, and that it is in fact, what's best and protective under our mission. So that does answer my question. Thank you, Director Murphy, and I think that's all I got, Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez. And so just to sort of reiterate that point, Director Murphy, if we had 2 or 3 competing applications that are sitting, then if the PDC cap were to go away, then basically you and as the director and then us as commission would look and we would determine whether of those 2 or 3 competing applications, which one is the most protective, and that would likely gain approval. Okay, Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for the presentation. As Chair Robbins mentioned, I did join in and was listening from just about the beginning, but I may have missed with respect to sort of along the same lines here with other pending applications in the same area. Have there been conversations already with the other operators that have already submitted applications for this area?
Commissioner Najapa, thank you. I'll respond to that. The short answer is yes. There is one OGDP submitted by Extraction that essentially abuts the boundary of the PDC cap. But as it was filed, it had a wellbore that crossed the boundary into the OGDP. Prior to the protest deadline, PDC met with Extraction and they have reached an agreement about how to handle that single wellbore so that it will be located outside of the boundary of the cap, outside of the cap boundary. So I think it was actually an example, a good example, a positive example of the purpose of the notice, of PDC's proactive engagement with those other working interest owners, and here just exactly what we would hope that would happen if somebody knew they had plans to sit down and try to work through it with PDC, and that's what has happened.
Great, thank you, Mr. Lepore. I'm not seeing other questions at this time, and maybe we can just have some comment before we take a motion on the proposed variance. I'm very much in favor of granting the variance. I'm pleased to see PDC leading the way with regard to its work on a comprehensive area plan. I think that we did indeed come to the conclusion in our mission change rules that we strongly encourage operators to submit caps. We felt there were significant benefits to the landscape level planning. I think you guys have done a good job of sort of articulating that. I look forward to getting bi-monthly updates from PDC on this. I note for the record that this is uncontested, that you did reach out to all those with interest, and that there were no one that contests this matter. I also note for the record that we have very positive letters of support from at least 2 communities within the CAP. The city of Greeley and the city of Evans both presented positive letters of support for the granting of the variance at this stage. And finally, I would note that, I think that we should recognize that while we developed the Rule 314 Comprehensive Area Plan, we did develop this, and it was based a little bit on the comprehensive development plans that were in previous rules, but this is a new, this is a new day. This is a new thing, and it does require a good deal of effort on the part of the operator here. I think probably what we're seeing in terms of the fact that you thought you could get it done within 6 months and now it's more like 12 months is probably the cumulative impacts analysis and the CIDR analysis that needs to be developed in order for you to get to that completeness determination. And all of that's a positive thing. I mean, that's good stuff. That's what we want to see. And absent having done that, you're not going to get to a place where you've got a complete application. And so, 2020 hindsight, we may have thought through when a stay could be issued, and maybe it could have been at an earlier stage. So with all that, I'm very supportive of this. I look forward to receiving bi-monthly reports, as I've indicated, and would look to other commissioners for comments and or a motion. Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the comments that you just made. I think they're similar along the lines of where I'm thinking. I appreciate the questions that other commissioners raised with respect to the ability to revisit the stay or to look at considerations that may arise during the time of the stay. And I also appreciate that there were no protests that were raised during this time. I think this is I was somewhat concerned about any precedent we might be setting, but I think this is unique in that we have a large amount of mineral ownership and leasehold that is with PDC already. And the conversations that have been had with the other operators in the area seem to indicate that there's, there's good agreement and cooperation. But I think especially for me and just for all who are listening, that we still will see the actual application, the surface location, the cumulative impact analysis, all that stuff before we actually approve the cap itself. And I think I would be open to entertaining a not to exceed timeframe, as Commissioner Messner suggested, for the stay, but I also appreciate that this is a lengthy process, and that in doing this we are facilitating this process that we all agreed was a good one overall for a long-term strategic and landscape level planning. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa. Commissioner Messner, I was going to respond to Commissioner Nanjapa's last point, but I'll let you go first.
Go ahead, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, my point on the not to exceed is that we are in sort of uncharted territories, and I'm comfortable that the bi-monthly check-ins will accomplish a continued forward approach by the operator in this case. And I just don't know what that right not to exceed monthly number should be. And as long as we're receiving bi-monthly check-ins that show, diligent due progress, I'm comfortable not, at least with this commissioner, not needing a not to exceed date. Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's similar to where I was at. I think that typically I'm going to be more comfortable with a not to exceed, and I think future variances along these lines probably, in my opinion, should include a not to exceed, but seeing how this is the first cap application and PDC is leading the way on this, I'm certainly willing to be flexible with the bi-monthly check-ins. I do acknowledge Commissioner Gonzalez's comments on the record around certainly wanting to see progress. And I think the not to exceed discourages any future operator utilizing a cap process to monopolize a particular competitive advantage. I don't think that's what's happening here today. I'm comfortable with the bi-monthly check-ins, and I appreciate PDC being the first to look at applying for a cap. So I am in support of this.
Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could I clarify the conversation that we've had previously, which is regardless we put like a not to exceed or not, it's the commission's, we would have the prerogative to say, this has been going on for a long time. We've not seen progress. There's another operator that has expressed interest, and then we could make a decision, correct? I guess the flip side of putting some date certain on, does that mean we'd have to reconsider the variance all over again, or could the commission extend the deadline?
Davenport?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner McGowan, I think the answer, I think you asked two questions and the answer is yes to both of them. If you added an expiration date to this stay that you're considering, PDC could come back in and ask for an extension on that expiration date. And as we've already discussed, if you see some reason why this stay should not continue after receiving one of those bi-monthly reports, then you could take action to lift the stay or some other action as well. I'll note for the commission that on page 4 of the proposed draft report, the commission does expressly reserve the right after notice and hearing to amend or repeal any of that order.
Thank you. Then I think I'm comfortable with the bi-monthly check-ins, and I think the commission will have a sense whether or not appropriate progress is being made and we're getting questions answered that we need. I would add that I feel like just for PDC's edification, I feel like you've set the bar pretty high and are dangling some big benefits that we discussed as part of a cap proposal, and so I'm looking forward to seeing what you all put together.
Mr. Lepore, Mr. Priscilla, I do have one sort of technical question now that AAG Davenport has pointed us to the actual proposed report. It indicates that you would appear, or PDC would appear at the commission's June 30th, 2021 hearing and bi-monthly basis thereafter. That's a month out. Are you still planning on, if we vote to approve the variance today, appearing today, as you mentioned earlier, and then again in a month, or is that not accurate given we're talking bi-monthly?
Mr. Chair, I'll start. We would be delighted to present to you today. We are looking forward to it. I have to tag on to Commissioner McGowan's last remarks to just say it's been a blast for me to work with PDC on this project and to see their dedication and commitment to delivering, I think, what's going to be the best onshore oil and gas development in Colorado's history, and maybe broader than that. But anyway, yes, they'd be delighted to address you if you have time after this. And I think we're probably agnostic about the June 30th. If you want us there, we'll be there. If you want to stretch it out a little bit, that's okay too.
Why don't we just keep it as is, and if you don't have a ton to report, given a small report today, that's fine, but that will just keep moving it forward that way.
Terrific.
Other comments from commissioners, or does any commissioner care to make a motion?
Mr. Chair, I will submit a motion for the approval of this variance. Do I need to state the docket number for the record, Mr. Davenport?
The docket number's in the agenda. I don't think you need to state it. Commissioner Gonzalez and Mr. Chair, may I briefly cut in on something just to make sure we're all clear?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Commissioners, you've been through this process somewhat with consent agenda before, and just so you're aware, if there is, as Commissioner Gonzalez has just made, and we haven't gotten a second yet because I cut in, a motion to approve the application and you have a draft order and report before you, your approval of that motion will approve that draft report and order exactly as it is written.
Yeah, that's what I was going to clarify as well. So Commissioner Gonzalez, is that part of your motion that the draft report of the commission would be approved?
That is correct.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Do we have discussion?
I think, Mr. Chair, I'm going to stand by the comments I'd previously made and just reiterate that this variance is unique to its own particulars and its own specifics, and each future variance that comes before us will be evaluated the same way. So that's all I got to say on that.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez. And just for our stakeholders that are listening in, there's 118 of them. We have before us a motion to approve a variance which has to do with not further undertaking review of Ogdps and DSUs within the application lands. This is not an approval of a comprehensive area plan itself, but this does give the applicant the opportunity to continue down the path toward development of the comprehensive area plan. And so just sort of piggybacking off of Commissioner Nanjapa's point earlier, want the record to be clear what's being approved and what's not. Having said all that, I'm excited to see PDC leading the way with regard to development of a comprehensive area plan, and I look forward to the bi-monthly updates and to the actual application once it's filed, and we'll look forward to adjudicating it on its merits. With that, seeing no other discussion, all those in favor, or Commissioner Messner?
I'm just getting ready to vote.
All those in favor of the motion indicate by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Great. The staff draft report of the commission is approved, as is the correlating order, and the variance is granted. With that, Mr. Lepore and Priscilla, if one of you wants to bring to the table someone to give us our first bi-monthly report, we'd love to hear it.
Thank you. Yes, we have Dana Strunk, Vice President of Planning and Development, here to present. And I think we just need to have Director Zoom her in.
I appreciate your belief in my abilities, Joe, but not my gift. However, I'm sure Mimi.
With us now?
Looks like I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
All right. Thank you, commissioners and chair. It's great to be here. Great to hear the discussion that was just going on with the granting of the variance, and PDC is very excited to move to the next stage of this CAP planning process. I have some prepared remarks with our current status, and then I can open it up to questions. So with that, have you seen in our application the Guanella CAP, which we've named after the Guanella Pass in Colorado's Front Range, encompasses approximately 32,640 gross acres, which is about 51 square miles, all within Weld County.
We are awaiting full title, but preliminary abstract work has shown PDC with an average of more than 90% working interest within the CAP boundaries. Our current development plan includes upwards of 450 wells, the majority of which are 2-mile laterals. As we've honed our development plan, we use the alternative location analysis guidelines to evaluate over 100 surface locations. And we're able to narrow down our current location count from somewhere in the mid-30s to 25. One of the most significant aspects of our future CAP is our ability to plug and reclaim more than 600 vertical wells over the course of development. When we're looking at the footprint of these older wells compared to the footprint of our new pads, the community will see a net back of 1 square mile of reclaimed land. Said another way, the amount of acreage we plan on reclaiming will be 1 square mile more than what would be disturbed as a result of the current plan. The CAP also allows us to take advantage of long-term infrastructure planning. We are partnering with utility companies to work toward full electrification of our drilling operations and production facilities, substantially reducing emissions. To that end, we hired a world-class expert to support our cumulative impacts assessment process, ensuring we provide you all with a best-in-class scientific assessment. We are also working with our midstream partners to find the most efficient ways to pipe oil and gas off location, with a stretch goal of putting all water on pipe as well. We're able to achieve these efficiencies because of the long-range planning and certainty that comes with a comprehensive area plan. The CAP really is a holistic look at development, and it allows us to be a good steward on all levels. Even though we're still fairly early in the process, it was important for us to begin to communicate with the key stakeholders and establish transparency around our future plans. As you are aware, we did not have any protests on this application for a variance, and we were pleased to have had encouraging initial conversations with our relevant working interest partners. In one of those conversations, we needed to work through some potential issues, but we were able to find mutually agreeable alternatives that led to that no protest outcome. While we can't ensure that there will not be a protest in the future, we appreciate the support we've received thus far. We've also met with the cities of Greeley and Evans and the towns of Gilchrist, LaSalle, and Milliken. To be clear, we only have surface locations planned in Greeley and Evans, and both cities have submitted letters of support for the CAP, but we also wanted to meet with all the proximate local governments to ensure they're fully informed. All of those conversations were positive and supportive. We also have had several meetings with Weld County in an effort to coordinate closely, similar to the regular meetings we're holding with the COGCC staff. These meetings have been very productive, and we plan to continue that steady cadence. In each of those meetings, we've placed a large emphasis on talking to the elected officials about how best to engage their communities, and they've been very appreciative of our focus on communication. It's important to us that we have a comprehensive understanding of each community because we recognize there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to engagement. We know that some communities have different expectations around the way they want to receive communication. Some may prefer a letter and others may look for in-person forums. And we want to create multiple opportunities for two-way conversation. We hope to encourage feedback from members of the community at a time and in a manner that makes sense for them. So this is something that we're putting an incredible amount of thought into, and we're working closely with our external consultants to develop a program that meets the very specific needs for each community. We anticipate a good chunk of our regular updates will focus on the communications plans for our disproportionately impacted communities and the communities at large. Hopefully this update has shown you the tremendous amount of value PDC puts in the CAP process and the ability to take a big picture, landscape level approach to planning and development. PDC's perspective is that the intersection of community engagement, environmental protection, and resource development represents the future of the industry. I want to make it clear that substantially more work remains, but we're eager to continue this process and we're confident in the model you have developed. We look forward to sharing more details and subsequent updates, and we appreciate the opportunity to do so. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to see if there are ones that I can answer given where our plan is today, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Strunk, for the presentation. I'm looking to see if any commissioners have questions. Great, I'm not seeing any. We will let you get back to work and look forward to hearing back from you at our, was it June 30th or June something hearing, whatever it was in the order. So thank you.
That sounds great.
Mr. Chair, I was just, will we receive a copy of Ms. Strunk's remarks in writing, or could we?
I'd be happy to send them along if you would like them.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Great.
Thank
It
you
is
again for the opportunity.
very good. We'll see you on June 30th.
All
Good luck.
right. Thank you.
All right, commissioners, that takes us through the PDC request for variance. We now are set up for general public comment. If everybody's comfortable with it, we'll just move right into that. We've already had a little bit of a break, but if we do need other breaks, just let me know. And with that, we would look to Hearings Manager Larson for general public comment. I do not have my paragraph relating to civility ahead of me because I forgot. So I apologize for that, but you guys all know the rules and parameters of speaking to us. Everybody's got 3 minutes. We'll have the 3 minutes on the on the dais to keep everyone informed. And we look forward to hearing from you when we ask that you be civil in your engagement with us. And so with that, I think we've got about 18 people lined up for public comment this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And actually that number has gone down to 15. A few commenters informed us that they are unable to present this morning, and one individual elected to provide written public comment, which will be provided to all the commissioners. So with that, we will bring in Ms. Kate Christensen, and we will begin in just one moment.
And I believe we need Ms. Amaro to share a screen for the timer.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Kate Christensen. So as my door's open, that's weird. Thanks for taking my comments today. I'd like everybody to think back to the hour plus that we heard from the street this morning, because that's what I'd like my comments about. I appreciated Commissioner Messner's comments about equity. During this time, I made so many notes during especially Sam Bradley's presentation about things that were inaccurate that I would like to respond to, but I only have 3 minutes and he had over a half hour to speak. So I'd really like the commission to consider on their Wednesday presentations, hearing from people other than one of the inaccuracies in Mr. Bradley's presentation was when he was looking at the orphan well report, he made the assumption that when orphan wells were marked as complete in the list, that they were completely plugged, abandoned, and reclaimed. That is not the case. And since I don't have the time to go into detail about that, I encourage the commission to review Jan Brown's presentation on April 1st during the financial assurances docket. I think she starts, I wrote it down, she starts at 3 hours and 55 minutes. And she goes in depth into the orphan well report and exactly what it means when it's complete, which is not complete. I also wanted to talk about stripper wells. Mr. Bradley said that they're not a problem with the environment. He said it's the arrow, not the archer. I'd like to say that's not science. The science behind stripper wells is that if you shut down the bottom percentile, the lowest performing stripper wells, you would cut methane emissions by 11% and only cut oil and gas production by less than 0.5%. That's from a research article by Dr. Amy Townsend, Small, and others. So stripper wells have a significant impact on climate and the environment, especially compared to with the tiny bit that they produce. He was also talking about the economic impact of having all these stripper wells. I'd like a half hour to argue that the economic impact of employing laid off oil and gas workers to plug and abandon wells would be much more significant. Plugging and abandoned wells could be a jobs program for the state. I was on a call with Larimer County the other day, and there was worker after worker talking about how SB 181 killed their jobs. And it's not that. It's oil and gas companies going bankrupt. 200 of them went bankrupt in 2020, according to Houston Chronicle. And I never heard anything about the oil and gas severance tax stripper well tax credit. In 2018, stripper wells got over $61 million back from taxpayers. So
Ms. Christensen, I apologize.
There's
Your time
so much more
has.
to say. I hope that the commission considers hearing from voices other than industry during their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Christensen, for the comments, and just note that you do have an ability to provide us with written comments. And so we will now turn to our next speaker.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Next up, we have Ms. Heidi Lethwood.
Can you hear me and see me?
We can hear you and see you, Ms. Leithwood.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I need to pull up my notes here.
Okay, we'll hold off on the timer until you're
Thank
ready.
you, thank you. Yeah, I had to exit full screen to be able to get to my notes. So thank you, commissioners, for listening to the public today. I appreciated your questions in this morning's presentations, and I really appreciate that you are looking at some really complex issues in a thoughtful way. I found that the presentations were really informative about history and current practices. I just ask that you consider the historical information in the light of the current energy climate. In today's climate, no pun intended, we cannot assume that the future will be similar to the past, and that's what my comments today refer to. I want to talk about a few recent reports that you probably know about by the United Nations and by the IEA, that's the International Energy Agency, and how they relate to financial assurances. The growth of wind and solar development continues to be faster than the IEA forecasts. In fact, they just upped their estimate for wind and solar growth to 40% higher than it was just a year ago and 25% higher than 6 months ago. They say that wind and solar capacity will equal gas capacity by 2022. And we also know that it now has cost equivalence. We in Colorado need full cost bonding for new and existing wells to protect us from the inevitable decline of oil and gas. The IEA was originally established in the 1970s to help ensure a steady supply of oil, so it is no enemy of the industry. But like all of us, now it must adapt to the reality of climate change. In a report released just last week, it said we need to stop new fossil fuel development after 2021 to meet the 1.5 cap on global warming. Globally, we should be reducing by 6% annually. But here in Colorado, our reduction plan allows an increase in gas production by almost 40% by 2030. It really sounds like we're denying reality. The 2020 production gap report by the United Nations was already showing what the IEA recently reported. The world is on track to produce double the amount of fossil fuels before 2030 than is consistent with staying under 1.5. Double. And they looked at the US specifically. Same thing. We're producing double the amount we should be. Their report recommends that policymakers reduce the risk of stranded assets and communities by restricting new oil and gas production activities and infrastructure now. This relates to financial assurances. Not requiring full cost bonding is a subsidy. Please stop giving the subsidy. Stop protecting an industry that is phasing out and protect Colorado. Make sure the companies can clean up their own mess. We need full cost bonding for all existing and new wells. And thank you again for hearing me today.
Thank you, Ms. Leithwood, for presenting to us today.
Mr. Chair, next we have Brett Goodlett, and we will bring him in. Mr. Goodlett, we are ready for you when you are ready to begin speaking.
You need to unmute yourself, Mr. Goodlett.
You guys hear me now?
We can hear you now, yes.
Okay, great. I'm gonna try to start my video. Caught me a little early, but yeah, I'm ready. So, okay. Dear commissioners, my name is Brent Goodlett, and I'm a climate advocate for the people of Colorado. My comments today are related to this morning's presentations on financial assurances, as well as the recently released COGCC document entitled Idle and Plugged Well Methane Emissions Literature Review. I too reviewed multiple scientific journal articles in pursuit of answers to questions encountered by me and some fellow advocates with 350 Colorado. Thus, I'd like to highlight some important areas of agreement with said literature review, followed by some potential shortcomings with its perspective, wherein the literature review fails to incorporate a broad historical perspective of data which are available to inform projections of Colorado's future methane emissions from oil and gas wells. Okay, to start with some key takeaways from the COGCC review. First, it differentiates all wells into one of three categories, 1 being plugged, 2 idle, or 3 active. And then it proceeds to specify emissions by category, starting with plugged wells, where emissions are near zero on average, so long as the well is not experiencing an integrity failure. Next are emissions from idle wells, which are non-zero, but typically measured in a small range of values that are 1 to 2 orders of magnitude less than that of a typical active well, which makes these active wells as a category the biggest emitters by group. And finally, the review notes that a majority of methane emissions are from a tiny minority of wells that it describes as super emitters, with these super emitters typically linked to an integrity failure of the well, and not whether the well is a plugged well, an idle well, or an active well. Now, this last point is key. Super emitter wells are linked to integrity failures, and integrity failures are linked to many different factors, including the geological formation, whether the wells are vertical or directional, local laws and conditions, and importantly, the age of the well. Now, here's where I'm critical of the review, which admits that, quote, COGCC could locate only one study that measured emissions from idle and plugged wells in Colorado, and then it proceeds to rationalize away the relatively high level of emissions recorded from wells in other states. But the problem with this hyper-focus on Colorado data, and specifically measured data, is that it only provides a small snapshot in time and does not attempt to forecast how that picture might change in the decades ahead, particularly as these wells age and the risk of integrity failure increases. I mean, ask any engineer and they'll tell you that no piece of infrastructure lasts forever. Thus, failures are inevitable. And given regular testing of wells in Colorado is woefully insufficient for timely detection of integrity failures, I shudder to think how long super emitter wells are going to be left to emit significant amounts of methane.
Mr. Goodlett, I apologize for interrupting, but your time has been met.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, next up we have Lucy Molina, and we will bring her in just one moment. Ms. Molina, we are ready for you if you're ready to begin your comments.
Ms. Molina, you would need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, okay. Buenas tardes. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. I always try to prepare something, but It never usually goes as I plan, but I just want to share right now. As you guys know, I always share my story about all the illnesses that our families are facing. You know, I want to tell this commission, you guys have an opportunity to make a change for us. This industry is like a mafia, right? I always mention how, you know, if you want a hamburger, a burrito, or a taco, you're not forced to go to one place or McDonald's. There's like options, right? So we need those options as well. As we know, we are facing a climate crisis. And as a mother, I keep thinking of what Miss Kate Christensen mentioned last week, and it's kind of, I am having nightmares about that. We need choices, and I think this commission, as well as these leaders, you guys have the opportunity to make a change and to set an example, not only for this state, but for the rest of the nation, that we care about our future, that we care about our environment, and that we want to protect our families. So, you know, also the water is, as you know, I live in Commerce City where we have no drinking water. It's been issues forever here in Commerce City. We're known for the stinky city, right? You know, it's kind of scary to know that even in the fracking industry, they're using up all our water, and then they flush it down the wells or whatever they do. To my understanding, talking to some of my clients that they work in the industry, they tell me, you know what, Lucy, if I can make the same amount of money what I make in this industry, then I probably wouldn't do it, because the land never heals. The land never heals. So do remember that if we have no water, no air, there's no future for us. We need climate action. I asked this commission, you guys have the opportunity not only to, you know, change our future, protect our future, and also don't let the industry bully you. Okay, you have a hope, the whole state and the people behind you. Don't be allowed. Don't be bullied. Don't let them to bully you, because there is option. Surely McDonald's was not going heads with Burger King when they brought their own version of burgers, right? We need options. We need options and energy that protect our future. Again, no water, no air, no future. We need a climate action, and you guys, you have the opportunity to protect us. Thank you. God bless you all.
Thank you, Ms. Chacon.
Well,
Next,
3 minutes. You guys prepared me good already.
Good job. Thank you.
next up, we have Ms. Renee Millard-Chacon, and we will bring her in. Ms. Chacon, we are ready for you if you would like to unmute.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes,
Can you hear
yes,
me?
we can.
Buenos dias, Colectaneti. My name is Renee Millard-Chacon. I'm a youth program coordinator at Spirit of the Sun, an indigenous nonprofit here in Denver. Understanding restorative justice is knowing where your system has become designed to cause harm for the sake of exploitation. How immoral and degrading it has honestly become for years after years to compare our health benefits compared to economic benefits. And I honestly shudder to think for future generations when it comes to their rights to thrive, or with respect to their rights to nature or their rights to live. You have truly shown that you are no community experts when it comes to our health for generations. And you'll find benefits for exploitation for economic backing. This is environmental racism and targeting, but ultimately a policy-making blind spot to our communities when it comes to authentic justice. We need disproportionately impacted communities having monitoring, modeling, accountability, and enforceability when we already know that there's been harm by who, what, when, where, and which corporation and energy is causing that harm, from predatory capitalism and white supremacy erasing us from these lands. Our health is not something to compromise on anymore for the sake or any concession for your economy or any form of benefit for that. There is blood in your profits. And every time that you pass any form of a permit that does not actually protect future generations, you are not here for the current ones. I ask that you keep in mind that it is our rights to nature now, and it is our future generations' land, air, and quality of life that we need to bring in, that there is no form of equity analysis for disproportionately impacted communities. I too live in Commerce City. I suffer from anemia. My sons suffer from asthma and nosebleeds consistently. It's more than just methane. It's benzene, hydrogen cyanide, hydrogen sulfide, and many other chemicals that are fiercely dangerous chemicals to play around with public endangerment. These are many forms of indigenous, mixed indigenous of the land of the Ute, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, Lakota, Comanche, and 48 tribes that still travel through here. And when we're trying to offer things like food share in many other spaces, we can't even grow this kind of food anymore in the first year. It's things like that that we do need to keep in mind for future generations. It's not just the air and quality, but literally the land that we're standing on that we need to pull particulate pollution from. So you do need to be mindful about energy sectors that are coming in, how they can be predatory, and how they do continue to cause the same cause of harm and systemic violence to disproportionately impacted communities. For now on, we need to move with restorative justice and equity analysis. I thank you for listening today, and I ask that you act in a good way to be a good living ancestor for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chacon. Next up, we have Shayna Oliver.
Hello?
Yes, Ms. Oliver, you're ready to go.
Hi, thank you. Again, I just wanted as a reminder that we are on the stolen lands of the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, and Ute, especially in this area, especially where these extractions are taking place. And as well as Sand Creek massacre that happened, of the murderers of our children, the women, the elders, whose heads were paraded on the downtown streets. This is a legacy that we continue with oil and gas, because when the Indian Removal Act happened, especially the enforcement, oil and gas appeared in these very same areas. So it is no mistake of these industries and the continued genocide that they continue to perpetrate in these same very communities where people of color continue to live, including indigenous community members, are also still in these very areas of these 48 tribes. And it's a shame that we can't see through what we're actually living, the reality that we're living, and the connection of climate change, wildfires, and our lack of food sovereignty, and where our future is headed. And being a member of the Navajo Nation, I know firsthand what it is to be diagnosed with asthma as an infant, to be born with a birth defect and not find out until later in life. Many of our people are being impacted in this way, and even in this community, community members continue to be ignored of their health impacts, especially when it comes to adverse birth defects. There's many children being born with a lack of development in their bodies, and that's not being adhered by this commission, is the health impact. You're supposed to be protecting the public's health and the environment, and providing and preserving a future for our communities. And I'm so glad that Ford finally came out with an electric truck, because Colorado has the most truck users I've seen in these last decades. And with the reduced reliance on fossil fuels, this industry will continue to dwindle. And that's what we need to see and realize, that innovation and technology is here, and we need to move with the technology and advancement in cleaning our air and reducing our poor air quality from 8th to being ranked 50
on that list instead of being the 8th for poor air quality for ground level ozone. So please keep health impacts in mind and protect the public's health and environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Oliver. Mr. Chair, next we have on our list J.D. Roybal. I'm not locating Mr. Roybal at the moment. I know sometimes he does call in. I'm not locating his phone number at the moment either, though. So we'll continue to look for him, and I can bring in Ms. Harmony Cummings.
Hi, my name is Harmony Cummings, and I spent 8 years working in oil and gas. I've been to scores of fracking sites in North Dakota on indigenous lands where there was so much gas flaring off that it looked like a war zone. I've been to crude oil loading sites in Weld County, and I've been to the poison sugar fields of Louisiana. I've been to the private planes, I've been to the happy hours, I've been to the parties, I've been to the board meetings. I'm here today to talk about some of the rhetoric that kept me in the industry so long and what continues to have a stronghold on keeping us going in this terrible direction, and it's job creation. We have this idea that oil and gas creates all these jobs and we care about our workers. I'm going to tell you that this isn't true, at least in the meetings that I've been in. We really only care about money, not the environment, not people, not the communities, just a handful of a select few who have a stronghold on a lot of money. Not just in the oil and gas, but in the railroads, in the pipelines, in the refineries, in the chemical facilities, everywhere that you can imagine. There's so much money, so much power as we continue to destroy people, lives, and this earth. There is no planet B. If these jobs are so good and abundant, why do these areas remain the poor after decades of having so many great oil and gas jobs in them? One of those reasons is, have you ever spent time in a man camp? Is this where you would want to work? Your wife, your children? It's not where I ever want to go back again. And think about that. When we fly folks in to these communities, pay them, and then fly them back home. That's not really making any improvements in communities, is it? But we had a guy die on one of our sites. You want to know what happened? Not shit. No one cared. So yeah, let's keep creating this whole rhetoric. We care about jobs. These are just the worker ants that we're building money off of their backs. The other thing that they like to do is, let's write a big check to the fire department or the food bank, maybe $25,000, maybe $55,000, so that we look good. Maybe you could go to Extraction Energies and look at some of their checks that they send out. Well, why do we have some of the highest need food banks in Weld County if we've been doing such a great job creating these jobs here for decades? Again, I'll ask that question to you guys again. And again, is this where you want to work? Is this where you want your children to work? Is this where you would want your parents to work? Are these the communities that you would want to live in, want your families to live in? Because I'm looking at all of you on this call, and I'm going to guess that none of you live in these communities, or close to none. Probably not where you want to be. So why is it okay to put other people here and have them live in these conditions? I also want to ask you, what's your definition of environmental justice and equity? I've been on a lot of these calls with a utility on Montana, one of the reddest states in the nation, and at least they're trying. But again, like rhetoric and we create jobs, it's all a lot of talk and your actions do not align. Please do better.
Thank you, Ms. Cummings. Next on our list is Ian Thomas Tafoya. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing Mr. Tafoya in our meeting, so we'll continue to look for him. And we'll bring now in Janice Hollowell. Ms. Hollowell, if you would like to unmute, we are ready for you.
There we go. Now can you see me? Can you hear me?
Hear you. We cannot see you.
Well, let's see. Yeah, all I see on my screen is a flashing thing. Start my video. There we go.
Okay, we can see you and hear you.
Okay, great. Good morning. And I just wanted you to, never mind. The International Energy Agency has recently stated there's no need for investment in new fossil fuel supplies beyond what is already committed. This directly refutes the so-called greenhouse gas roadmap, which plans for 86% increase in oil production and 41% increase in gas production by 2030. Given the extreme cost to the health of the people in Colorado, why would the state of Colorado want to issue more permits to drill? You know the answer. The imperative made by CEOs and the politicians they control to continue the practice of the state of Colorado, which, let me remind you, is supposed to be the people of Colorado, to continue subsidizing and bailing out the oil and gas industry. This is a travesty of justice, of trust, of all values that we hold dear. And the fact is, we don't have any more room in the world for these kinds of deals. I'm calling on you to stop issuing permits completely and now. The insanity needs to stop. The taxpayers of Colorado have paid with our money, our health, and the health of our children. It's time to consider equity for the taxpayers of our state, who will have to pay $8 billion when we finally get around to plugging these wells. Also, oil and gas companies must be held accountable for their own liabilities, including the realistic cost of responsibly plugging every single well and the sites around the wells. This is just and fair. But in the spirit of providing information and ideas that these financial assurances hearings are supposed to be about, I sent you HR 2415, the Well Plugging and Job Creation Bill. In looking at this new legislation and the growing carbon capture credits that are available for those plugging wells with sequestrable materials, it's important to understand and act on the fact that the citizens of the state, since the state owns many of the existing orphan wells, can benefit and offset some of the costs using carbon credits. I just got out of a meeting with carbon futures who say that any legal entity can buy and sell carbon credits, even the state of Colorado. They can help Colorado create a program to do exactly that. So instead of oil and gas companies realizing the carbon credits, the state of Colorado can. I don't have time in 3 minutes to go into detail, but this is one way for the state to begin to recompensate the people for the terrible disaster of fracking wells that's been forced on us. If you would like specific contacts to learn more about this, as always, I'm happy to provide. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Hollowell. Next up, we have on our list Mr. Wes Wilson, and I've not been able to locate Mr. Wilson in the meeting at the moment. We'll continue to look for him. We do have Marie Venner, and I will bring Ms. Venner in, and give me one moment.
Good afternoon. Thank you for attending the Colorado law and mandates and the related calls you hear every week from the people of Colorado. I have faith in you and your ability to make the shifts that are needed to put public health and safety first, to improve fiduciary responsibility to ensure coverage of the over $8 billion in well closures without letting polluters go free. As you celebrate the good, as you've heard in a number of presentations that are allowed a longer space in previous weeks, please keep in the back of your mind the question of how many and what percentage of the whole are restored, like the pictures you are shown, or have processed water clean enough to safely feed wildlife. Coloradans are concerned about the big unaddressed problems. I am particularly concerned about the views or inclination that the law, legislation, does not really apply to the executive branch, that you get to decide it all when and if you get to the regulation, which we all know has been delayed in multiple ways. Very important Colorado law was negotiated in late 2018 and passed after thorough debate in 2019. That legislation promised 26% pollution reduction by 2025 across all existing infrastructure, wells, homes, and cars. Much time was wasted after this. And the Polis administration has approved over 4,000 wells installed on implementing regulations that will get Colorado to these statutory reductions in time. As you've heard, the IEA, the world's leading energy authority, an organization that serves fossil fuel companies as well as governments, stated conclusively that there should be no new oil, gas, or coal development, none, if we are to achieve critical climate goals. The IEA laid bare the scale of the challenge. Please do not take Colorado's chance to avoid heating, drought, and dust vilification from us. It threatens our state's livability. Please be able to look your kids and grandkids in their eyes this next decade and take action to ensure that Colorado meets its pollution reductions for 2025. Continuing as you have does not remotely comply with the law. And I want to echo those who came before me. Dr. Goodlet's question, how long will these super emitter wells be allowed to operate? Ms. Molinas, don't let yourself be bullied. No water, no air, no future. Ms. Chacon, that our health is not something to compromise on anymore. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Venner. Next up, we have Guillermo Serna.
There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
We can.
Okay. I've been listening to all of this in perspective to just one issue, and that's soil. But the most important issue is that we as human beings are part of the environment, and you're destroying our environment. You don't and are not giving the lowest part of that environment in perspective to our children, in perspective to the needs of these people that are in that situation. Take a look at the Platte Valley, or the Platte River, and where it starts. Along its way, if you take a look, it's near the rivers where people need assistance, homeless, low income. And this is what's happening. Our waters are being polluted. We need assistance because our environment and the situations that come with it do matter, because we're human beings. You are not doing your job simply because the reports that the people are coming up with are not really being discussed in 3 minutes. I would like to see you face to face and give me one day all the elegance of the people that have been testifying, from the poor to the rich, that want a new environment, because you're killing us with rules and regulations that don't mean a thing to you, because you're not reporting back to your leadership. Our president, who is asking for your assistance, you're not hearing him. Our governor, who really at this point is not reacting, He is not doing what you should be doing. And that is what our problems are. In 3 minutes, we can't discuss it. And we supposedly are the ones that count. But you are not doing your job. You have to start looking at the future. And that is what is going to be good about all this discussion. Don't think of the past, which has killed millions along the way. And we can save a lot more jobs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cerna. Next up, we have Christy Douglas.
Douglas, you may need to unmute yourself.
Hello, I just heard that I'm unmuted.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Oh, all right. Thank you so much. And thank you once again for holding weekly public comment. I really do appreciate it, because what I can't say in 3 minutes, I can always bring back the next week. And as you know, I am a faithful commenter. My name is Christy Douglas, and I'm a social justice activist from Commerce City in Adams County. I'm also serving as the co-chair for North Range Concerned Citizens, NRCC, which is just a group of volunteer citizens who are aware of what's going on, and we're fighting to protect our communities and our families and our neighbors. And usually I say that I'm just speaking in my own behalf, but now I've been given permission to speak in behalf of everyone who considers themselves a part of North Range Concerned Citizens. Because these people can't always show up. They're working. A lot of them have calamities happen in their lives that they need to attend to. And a lot of them are working several jobs just to make ends meet. We are the people who live hand to mouth. We are the people who know what struggle is. But we're also the people who know how to fight, because we've had to fight to protect our lives, our very lives. So it was interesting listening to the presentations that were made by industry this morning. It just proves my point about there being double standards, one for the industry and one for the public. And what I see once again is the fact that they are here to protect their livelihoods. We are volunteers, and we are here to protect our lives. We don't want these dangerous industrial operations in our neighborhoods. We don't want more drilling, because we know how it's affecting the climate crisis that we're in. You know, and I do appreciate the fact that it was nice that you forgot to bring along the code of conduct that the citizens are supposed to follow, because it was really nice not to have to hear that. Apparently we can
Ms.
speak,
Douglas,
but we
I
can't
apologize.
speak the truth.
You're
All right, just one more sentence. Apparently we can speak, but we can't speak the truth of our experience. I'll be back next.
Thank you, Ms. Douglas. Finally, Mr. Chair, we do have Ms. Tess Dowdy. We will bring her in just a moment.
Hi there. I just wanted to play a little clip from a NPR article from a couple of years ago about the wells in Colorado.
Reporter Matt Bloom with member station KUNC in Colorado reports.
Plugging just one of these wells can take more than a week, and that's not counting the months of paperwork that needs to be done leading up to the actual job. By the time it's over, it can cost upwards of $80,000.
And this is an awesome vantage point.
Mike Hickey is an engineer with the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. He's overseeing a plugging northeast of Denver. On the surface, the well looks small, just a couple feet of dirty pipe jutting out of the ground. But it's about a mile deep underground. The 7-man crew starts by yanking long sections of the pipe out one by one. With this well, Hickey says they're kind of playing it by ear.
We never operated these wells, so we are not completely sure what's in them until we start pulling it out.
There are a lot of ways wells get abandoned or orphaned in industry lingo. Some companies go bankrupt. In this case, the owner got sick about 3 years ago, racked up violations, and lost his drilling rights. It then became the state's responsibility to plug it so it doesn't leak. Similar scenarios have been happening so often in Colorado. Last year, the state legislature approved a 10-fold increase in funding for orphaned well cleanup. States like Alabama and Ohio have followed suit, as did Pennsylvania, where it's estimated there could be up to 560,000 abandoned wells.
Every state that has oil and gas has this problem because the industry has not been held accountable by the regulators and by the government to pay the cost of doing business.
Jill Morrison heads the Powder River Basin Resource Council, an environmental group in Wyoming. That state beefed up funding for its program 5 years ago after a coal bed methane bust. Morrison worries another bust could put its budget over the edge.
We're going to quickly be in the tens of millions of dollars responsible for plugging and reclaiming oil and gas wells if we don't require upfront bonding.
That means making companies pay the full cost of capping wells even before they start drilling. But the industry pushes back on that idea. Lynn Granger is with the American Petroleum Institute, a national trade group.
For the most part, our operators are very responsible. They are taking care of their wells, and that is not left to the state.
Granger points out, for example, that in Colorado, less than 1% of all oil and gas wells are abandoned. But that doesn't mean the state isn't concerned about them. In fact, the opposite is true. Colorado has set a deadline of 2023 to get the highest risk ones plugged. That
I'll stop it.
Thank you, Ms. Valerie, and thank you for staying within the time frame. Ms. Larson, did any of the folks that we missed show back up into the queue at all?
I have not found them, Mr. Chair. We can do one quick last look and just ensure that we don't see them, but we have been
Read off
looking.
the names: Soleil Gaylord, J.D. Rubel, Philip Doe, Wes Wilson, Janice Brown. If any of you are in the meeting, if you want to raise your hand, we will identify you as someone that had signed up for public comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just one clarification, Ms. Gaylord submitted a written public comment and asked not to be called on for oral comment today.
Okay, thanks. All right. Seeing none, I think we are through with public comment. As part of our agenda, moving onward, we do have 3 items, 3 pooling orders on consent. Does anyone have questions with regard to consent agenda? Seeing none, do we have a motion to approve consent agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second on consent agenda. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Consent agenda passes. And we are at the last piece of our agenda is commissioner comments. Do commissioners have comments?
Sorry, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
I apologize. I did have just a couple of follow-up questions about the administrative order by consent for Berry Petroleum. I apologize. I thought that was separate from the consent agenda.
No problem.
So I did send some questions to Mimi. What's your title? Sorry, I'm drawing a blank. To Mimi.
No, it's
to
fine.
give her a heads up that I was going to ask these questions. So I think staff's going to be prepared to respond. I'm sorry. I'm drawing a blank.
No, Commissioner McGowan, not a problem. Hearings manager or Mimi is just fine.
Thank you, Hearings Manager Larson.
We do have Caitlin Stafford here on behalf of staff, counsel to staff, and she is ready to answer any questions you have. And if you have more technical questions that Ms. Stafford would like to refer to COGCC staff, we can certainly bring those individuals in.
Okay, thank you. So as part of the NOV, it looked to me like staff asked for a report from Berry Petroleum about where all of their flow lines existed and whether or not they had been properly reported to the commission. And I was just wondering if that report was turned in and what were the results?
Am I okay to continue?
Yeah, sorry, I muted myself. AG Stafford, please go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you for your question, Commissioner McGowan. So as part of the NOAV process, the operator is required to submit an answer within 28 days following the issuance of the NOAV. As far as I understand it, staff received the information they asked for in those corrective actions regarding the, I believe it was the information regarding registration of off-location flow lines, and then further information provided regarding the root cause of this particular incident. So as far as I understand it, staff received that information.
Staff has not received it yet? Sorry.
They have received it.
They have received it. So I was just wondering what the results of that were. And then I think they were supposed to come up with a compliance plan.
I can, that might be a more technical question that might be more proper for Mark Schlagenhoff to answer, if I could get him in.
Yeah, hi, this is Mark. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. First, we'll deal with the root cause. It was internal corrosion. It looks like they've replaced the pipe with a smaller pipe. One of the problems we have is if you have a larger line and the volume decreases, you can have water sitting on the bottom. They've replaced this pipe with about 400 feet of smaller pipe, which should increase the velocity and sweep the fluid out. So that deals with the root cause and preventing future reoccurrence. This is a common issue where you have low-lying spots on the pipeline. In terms of the forms, they had some water lines that needed to be bonded and registered, and I think there were 3, and then there were some other lines that were registered, and I have Elise Whittington here if you want an exact count. She can give it to you because she worked on these Form 44s. But we believe that they have registered what they needed to register on the off-location flow lines. There are some sites that we believe are not registered because they have on-location flow lines, and we have not done a site visit to every location, but we believe they're fully registered now.
Thank you. And then my second question was whether or not we thought this was a one-time issue, or if there were potential other erosion or corrosion issues with Berry Petroleum's flow lines.
This is an operator that perhaps they have about one flow line reported spill a year. They just had one recently while they were pressure testing their flow lines. And the pressure test resulted in a reportable spill. So that's something we encourage operators to do. Anytime you have steel, you can have corrosion. I would expect to have corrosion, but this has not been a problematic operator with about one spill a year.
Thank you. And for me, this brings around full circle. I'm really looking forward to hearing from staff kind of about corrosion issues with equipment and what we do to help regulate and prevent. So I appreciate it. Thank you. I'm good. We don't need to revote, I don't think. We'll have to ask Kyle if that's okay, but.
Yeah, actually, that was a recommended order. And so that was something that was not part of consent agenda. And with your questions answered, if we take no action, that recommended order becomes an order. And so I look to other commissioners. Does anyone else have questions with regard to recommended order? And AAG Davenport, if I got any of that wrong, please correct me.
I don't need to correct you.
Okay.
Thank you for your patience as I mess up our agenda once again.
No, that's entirely part of the agenda. So thank you very much, Commissioner McGowan, for the clarifying questions. Thank you to staff and to AAG Stafford and to Mr. Schlegenhoff, who was with us there briefly. Seeing no further questions, the recommended order will become an order of commission as we move forward with our agenda at this point. And now we are at commissioner comments. Look to see if anyone has comments for us today. Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is actually for Commissioner Hackett, and it doesn't have to get answered today, but I am curious to know, out of the settlement funding, I know that we gave CDPHE some funds to collect additional air quality emissions data around oil and gas activities. And I think most of it's going to be flyover. As part of that data collection, are we going to be able to differentiate between, and I may have asked this question before, and I apologize if I don't remember the answer. Are we going to be able to differentiate between idle wells, producing wells, et cetera, to kind of get to, I think, questions that a lot of people have been asking. We don't really have a lot of data about how much is being emitted from certain types of wells in Colorado. And I'm wondering if this activity from CDPHE is going to help fill in some of those gaps.
Thank you, Commissioner McGowan. I will follow up with the Technical Services Program in the Air Pollution Control Division to get a firm answer on that. My preliminary response is that I do believe, so the aerial surveys or the flyovers, those will help us identify sources of emissions and also pinpoint those super emitters that some of the public commenters have referenced. But also as part of those flyovers, there's also going to be ground verification efforts. So, you know, there would be inspectors sent out with IR cameras to pinpoint the source, which presumably would be able to help us determine if that's from an idle well, a plugged in abandoned well, or an active well. So that's my preliminary response, and I'll go ahead and follow up with the right folks to make sure that's accurate.
Thank you. I think that information is going to be really helpful as I know for folks, sometimes it feels like the chicken's before the egg or the egg before the chicken, and we just have to do the best we can with the data we currently have. And I think the more we collect data, we'll use this to inform and fine tune decisions made by the commission And we'll be able to use that data too, then to help us determine if we're, making progress toward the reduction emission goals. And I think all these things are going to start fitting together. I'm hopeful that that's going to happen anyway. Thank you.
Other comments from commissioners? All right, not seeing other comments. We've had a full day. Thank you all for participating. Thank you to our stakeholders, 73 of you still with us. We will look to a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second. Motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We're adjourned. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon.